Okay, let's try again. I understand that it stopped. Apologies for those of you that had it on and then it's gone off. Hopefully it's working now. Okay, so just to recap in case you missed what I was talking about. So this question that I've got up is June 2016, question number 2 from the edXL spec. And it says the following: a firm which prints greeting cards records its short-run costs. It observes that the average cost per card decreases as more are produced, although the marginal cost is rising. It follows that, and we're going through the different options available to us. Now, as a starting point, it's important to understand that you need to highlight or underline the key words in every question, because they very often try and trick you. They very often try and give you an option that looks really appealing, but actually is the incorrect option. So the keywords in this question, number 1, the first keyword is the word short run. You should be underlining that. The other thing is that it's saying that AC is falling, and at the same time, MC is rising. Now, the most commonly selected option that year, which was incorrect, was option A, which I imagine some of you may have chosen yourselves as you were looking at this question. So option A says there are economies of scale, but economies of scale is a long-run concept. So although you have a decrease in average cost, that's true, it's in the short run, and therefore it cannot be economies of scale. So we can completely eliminate option A straight away. Now, with a question like this, because it's quite confusing and there's a fair bit going on, I think one of the best things to do is to just draw it out, because if you draw it out, you can very easily see what you need to look out for. Now, there are only 2 variables that are identified in this particular question that we need to draw out. So I've got a little whiteboard here. Hopefully you guys can see it nice and clearly. And on the whiteboard, what I'm going to draw, and you probably should be doing this as well, by the way. So those of you that are watching this, please make sure that you've got pen, paper, probably calculator for a couple of questions later as well, and draw the following. So it just has 2 variables, which is marginal cost and average cost. So I'm going to draw myself an MC curve there, okay? And I'm going to draw our average cost. Now, what do we know about the relationship between MC and AC? Well, when AC intersects MC, it must be at the lowest point on the AC curve. So a great way of doing that is just if you pick a point on your MC curve and just flick outwards, you just make sure it's always at the bottom of the AC curve. So I'm going to do something like that. Okay? So not the best drawn diagram in the world, but it will suffice. We've got an AC curve and we've got our MC curve. Now, let's look more closely at the question, because it says that for this particular firm, AC is falling, at the same time, MC is rising. So now I can depict the section that I'm looking at then. So MC is rising from here, and AC is falling, falling, falling up until the point where it hits the bottom of the AC curve, then it starts to rise again. Yeah? So in other words, I am looking at this range of output between there and there. Yeah? Okay, let's now look through the options and see which one we can find out as the answer. So let's start with B. The B says, the law of diminishing returns has not yet set in. Okay, so that is incorrect. The reason why is because the law of diminishing returns is when MC starts to rise. It's the idea that as I add more and more variable inputs to a fixed factor. So for example, let's say that you are a restaurant and you have a restaurant, so you have a kitchen in the back. In that kitchen, you're going to have 4 ovens. Let's say you add 1 chef to that particular kitchen. That chef is fairly productive. They produce quite a lot of output. So therefore, the rate at which output is rising is faster than the rate at which total cost is rising. So your MC is going down at that point. And that will keep happening up until you add the 5th chef. When you add the 5th chef, they now start to get in each other's way, and therefore you have the law of diminishing returns setting in, because MC now starts to rise. Well, on ours, in the range that they have identified in the question, MC is rising. Therefore, it cannot be B, because the law of diminishing returns has set in at that point. Option C. Option C says the fixed costs are 0. Well, my question to you then is, what is the definition of the short run? Well, the definition of the short run is, in the short run, at least one factor of production must be fixed. Therefore, it can't be C. It would be correct, by the way, if the question was a long run question, because in the long run, there are no fixed costs. But in the short run, there are definitely fixed costs. Therefore, C is also incorrect. Option D. Option D says marginal costs rise whenever average costs fall. Okay. Well, the concept of whenever makes this incorrect, because can you see on my diagram, that there is a section where my marginal cost is falling and my average cost is falling. So the idea that marginal costs are always rising whenever AC falls is not always true. So again, it is not D. That leaves us with the final option, which is the correct answer, which is E. Marginal costs are below average costs. Well, think about it or look at it. At every point, up until the point where they intersect one another, MC is lower than AC. Therefore, the correct answer is E. Okay? Hopefully that's a nice little starting point to get us warmed up and to get us moving into more essay type questions. So I will remove that question from the screen and you'll have to see my face in full now. Right, so there are a couple of things that I want to cover in the 2-hour session that we have together today. One of them is a couple of questions or a couple of topics that I feel are more likely to come up in this year's paper. Partly because they've not been asked in a sort of significant way in the past 2 papers in the new spec, but also because there's quite a fair bit for them to ask about that particular topic. So we'll hop around between micro and macro. We're not going to stay consistently on one or the other. But if you can please write the following question on your piece of paper. The question that I'd like us to go through is as follows. Evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of subsidizing renewable energy. And we're dealing with this as if it's a 25-mark question, okay? So again, the question was evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of subsidizing renewable energy. Now, before we go through how to approach this question or what the kind of theory underpinning this question is, it is important for you to understand that in the new spec, the 25 marker is not a question of how many points you make. It is far more important that you have depth to your points. So my recommendation for this is a paper 3 question, is that if you've got time and if the question lends itself, you'll have an introduction, then you're going to have a really, really chunky, in-depth micro point with evaluation, and then an in-depth macro point with an evaluation, and then a judgment. And we'll talk about what a judgment looks like and key things to do in a judgment. Now, the order in which you do it doesn't really matter. You can do macro first, micro after. You can intermix between the points, which is also fine. But I think it's a good idea for the 25 marker to make it very, very clear that this paragraph is mainly focused on either micro or macro, okay? Right, so this question lends itself to a fairly easy definition, which is subsidies. A subsidy is a grant given by the government to producers, which enables them to increase their output by reducing their production costs and reducing the price they charge consumers. Something vaguely like that, okay? Now, in the introduction, alongside defining explicitly stated terms in the question, it is also a very, very, very good idea to try and see if there are any implied definitions or whether there are more subtle definitions. And this is where you can differentiate yourself as a more capable student. Well, an implied definition here, which you should hopefully know, is the concept of a merit good. Renewable energy would be regarded as a merit good. And just as a recap, a merit good is basically a good that is under-provided or under-consumed in a free market economy. It often yields high external benefits. Basically, it's a positive externality. So therefore, I would straight away say that, and I would explain why, very briefly, why renewable energy would yield high external benefits. Well, renewable energy means there'll be less strain on the NHS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that, in a nutshell, is pretty much my introduction. If you're running out of time in an exam, or if the question, such as last year's paper about increased demand for coffee was the 25 marker, there isn't really much to define there. You just jump in, you go straight into the main point. But if you've got time and there are clear definitions and there are clear things to define in the introduction, do that. Otherwise, just jump in. Right. Because this is a concept that you would have been taught initially in micro, I think that it makes sense for us to start with a very basic micro point, which is to just go through the subsidy diagram. And so I want to take you guys through that in a very systematic way to ensure you know how to draw the diagram and you know all of the key points that you could use as part of your 25 marker to give it more depth. So, starting point. The starting point is the effect of a subsidy is that it reduces the production costs for a firm. So that should be essentially your first point, okay? And from that, we will build and have multiple different points in that first paragraph. And in order for us to do that, we need to draw the diagram, but we need to understand the diagram. And it's imperative that you understand why a subsidy diagram looks the way it does. So can we just ignore renewable energy just for 2 seconds and look at this? I will do my best to do it in a way where you guys can see it clearly. We said that a merit good is one that is underprovided in a free market economy. So let's have the following. We've got quantity there and we've got price there. And let's just do it in terms of like millions. I will pull up my board in a second so it's easier for you to see. Okay, like that. Cool, so we've got price there and we've got quantity on the x-axis in millions. Now, an example of a merit good could be something like bananas. So we would assume that not enough people consume fruit in the UK, and the government obviously feels that that's not a good idea because having a high volume of bananas means that people are healthier, blah, 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 right? So hypothetically, let's say that this is the supply and demand, S1, D1 for bananas, okay? And in my made up example, the number of bananas that are consumed in the UK is initially 100 million at a price of, let's say, 50p, okay? So my price is 50p, and the number of units that are consumed in this market at this moment in time are 100 million. Hopefully you can see that nice and clearly, yeah? Now, the government goes, that's not enough. I want there to be not 100 million units consumed, I want there to be 150 million units of bananas consumed. So I'm gonna pick the quantity 150 on my x-axis. Now, in order for the government to determine how much they need to subsidize this particular good, there are two questions that they need to ask. The first question is, what price would it need to be for consumers to want to buy 150 million bananas? Which curve is the consumer? Well, the demand curve is the consumer. Therefore, all I need to do is I go up from 150 million, like that, until I hit the demand curve. And let's say hypothetically that the consumer, in my very made up example, says, do you know what, if the price of bananas were 30p, I would buy 150 million bananas, okay? Now, that's not the only question the government should ask, though. The second question they have to ask is to the producer. They have to go, look, what would the price need to be to incentivize you to go and produce 150 million bananas? And which curve is the producer? Well, it's very straightforward. It's the supply curve. So now I dot up from 150 million until I hit the supply curve and I go across from that point. Now, hypothetically, let's say that the supplier goes, you know what, if the price is £1, if the price of each banana was £1, I would be willing to supply 150 million units to the market. The government therefore goes, okay, cool, no worries. Give the consumer the price they actually wanted for this particular item, for the banana. In other words, give them a price of 30p. And we, the government, will subsidize you the difference between what you actually wanted, £1, and what the consumer gives you, 30p. In other words, the government's going to subsidize this particular firm 70p for every banana they sell to the market. That is why the supply curve will shift right to this point here. It shifts parallel so that the new equilibrium becomes 30p. The consumer is going to get their 30p. The area that we shade in to determine the subsidy or the amount of government spending is I put my pen on the new equilibrium, which is here, and I draw a straight line up, okay? Now, if I put a straight line up, that straight line represents a subsidy rate. That is the amount the government is subsidizing per unit. So in our question, 70p. And then I go across from there and from there, okay? I mean, my straight lines are not happening today. It's very difficult to do this with it held up like this. But anyways, that total area, I would shade in or label as total government spending on the subsidy, okay? And you also need to be able to split up the subsidy between the consumer and the producer. Now, some of you, and you know who this is, try and memorize whether it's the top or the bottom of the rectangle. I never, ever, ever want you to do that. Whether it's a tax or a subsidy, the way that you are going to always do it is you go, okay, what is the change in the price? Whatever the change in the price is, that's the consumer, because the consumer is always the person who pays for the good or service. Therefore, in our question, the consumer used to pay 50p, they now pay 30p. In other words, this strip here, down there, which I've shaded like that, that is the consumer subsidy, yeah? And then I'm going to shade in green the producer subsidy, which obviously is just the remainder, which is that. Is that clear? Cool. So that's the systematic approach to constructing the diagram. Obviously, in my example, I made up numbers. You don't do that. You just do P1 and P2. But all you need to do is draw supply and demand, shift supply parallel and outwards, put your pen on the new equilibrium, straight line up. That distance is the subsidy rate. Go across. And then the difference in the price is the consumer subsidy, and the difference in what's left is the producer subsidy, and the whole area is government spending on the particular subsidy. Okay, cool. That diagram now gives us so many things to say. The first thing that you should do in a 25 market to add depth is actually explain what's happening. So actually explain the shift. So you say the subsidy causes supply to shift outwards from S1 to S2. As a result, the price of renewable energy will fall from P1 to P2, and the number of units will rise from Q1 to Q2. Okay, now we have so many things that we can say about this. One, so you might want to be bullet pointing some of these things. One is consumer surplus in a subsidy goes up. Producer surplus also goes up when there's a subsidy. So that's another benefit that you could talk about, okay? Now, on top of that, the producer has more money because the government is guaranteeing that they're going to give you, for every single unit that you sell, they're going to now provide you an additional 70p in my made-up example, right? So the producer has higher revenue, higher profits, and these profits can be invested into the latest technology, into R&D. She always mentions stuff like that. So, for example, they could use a new machinery, they could, whatever, right? That increases dynamic efficiency. So that's another point that you can now flesh out from there. Another point that you could talk about is, given that the price is now lower for renewable energy, people are more likely to switch away from substitute goods. You can show off by saying that substitute goods have a positive XED. So they go away from substitute goods, in this case, obviously non-renewable energy, towards renewable energy because the renewable energy now looks more attractive at the lower price. That is pretty detailed chain of reasoning. There's a fair bit there that you've basically developed in that paragraph. Now, to be clear, that is enough for micro. And you'll be able to tell, normally that it should be like a page worth of analysis, like really detailed chains of reasoning. But what I think is important for us to do in this session is to also go through extra points in case you forget one of the points, in case you think, you know what, I need this for another essay. And there are two other diagrams that we can also draw. We're not going to, just to be clear, I'm doing it now. If you were sitting this in the exam and this actually came up as the question, I would just go with the basic diagram first. Okay, that would be my starting point. But one of the things that we can definitely be discussing as part of the micro point is to deal with it as an externality first and then correct the externality, okay? So we assume there is an underconsumption of renewable energy, okay? So we need to draw a positive consumption externality. Those of you that are doing the AQA board, by the way, unfortunately for you, need to know 4 different types of externality diagrams. For those of you that are at Excel, they only expect you to know negative production and positive consumption. So those of you that are AQA, I will basically stay behind a little bit at the end for about 10-15 minutes if you're still awake at 9 o'clock. And I will go through your extra 2 diagrams with you in terms of how to construct those, because you would draw that. Anyways, so the diagram, in terms of what we can now put together, is a positive externality diagram. Well, on the axes, I'm going to have cost/benefits on the y-axis. And on the x-axis, I am going to just put quantity. Okay, so something like that. Let me move my laptop back so you can see. Okay, now, because it's a positive externality, is that to do with costs or benefits? Well, the name is a bit of a giveaway, which is it's positive, therefore it's to do with benefits. And the way for you to remember whether marginal benefit curves are upward sloping or downward sloping is to remember your favorite chocolate bar. So my favorite chocolate bar is a Kinder Bueno. If I were given a Kinder Bueno now, I would get a fair bit of benefit from that first bar. Imagine the second I finish that first bar, I'm given a second Kinder Bueno. Well, I'll enjoy it, but not quite as much as that first one. And so on and so forth. So if I get 7 in a row, the 7th one, I'm practically throwing up. Therefore, marginal benefits are always downward sloping on the basis of that logic, which is that the more you have of something, the less benefit you get from the extra unit. So because our analysis is focused on the benefits, I'm going to draw 2 slightly pivoted downward sloping curves, sort of like that, okay? And it follows that if I have 2 downward sloping curves, I probably only have 1 upward sloping curve, yeah? So, like that. Now, I can label that upward sloping curve immediately because there are only 1 cost curve there. And there are 2 players in every single externality, the private party and society. And we can label that, therefore, as marginal private cost, MPC, and it's equal to MSC, okay? So MPC equals MSC. Now, the next step, whenever you're constructing this diagram, is can you see that there are 2 points of intersection, there and there? I always want you to dot down and across from those 2 points before you label anything. So dot down and across, dot down, across, dot down, and across, okay? And then you ask yourself the following really straightforward question, which is it a positive externality or a negative externality? Well, it's a positive externality. If it's a positive externality, does that mean we're doing too little or too much? Well, in a positive externality, it's always where you're doing too little of something good. Hence why it's a merit good. It's that you're not doing enough of that thing. You're not consuming enough of it, or you're not producing enough of it. Now, can you see that there are two quantities on my diagram? Quantity number 1 there and quantity number 2 there. Which one, obviously, would represent doing too little? Well, obviously the one further to the left. Therefore, this quantity here must be 100% equilibrium. So I can label that QE. Okay, so we've got QE and PE. Now, the other point on the diagram, I always wanted to label that as either QS or P star, and Q star, P star. It doesn't matter which one. S is going to represent something called social optimum. So we've got Q star there, and we've got P star there, okay? So those are our labels so far. Now, the next thing that I'd like you to do always is once you've figured out what your quantity output is, you put your pen on the equilibrium. So there we go, it's there. Now, can you see that if I put my pen there, there is only one downward sloping curve going through that exact point. That line, 100%, irrespective of which externality you're doing, must be your private line. It just has to be. For it to be equilibrium, marginal private benefits equal marginal private cost. Therefore, it 100% is MPB. So I'm going to label that marginal private benefit. And therefore, the other line that I haven't labeled yet is marginal social benefit. Is that clear? Okay. Now, that's depicting the externality. The last thing that we need to do is to represent something called the welfare gain triangle. It's essentially what society could be gaining, but they're not gaining because they're not consuming enough of this particular item. So I'm going to put my pen back on the equilibrium again, which is there, and you just draw until you connect. So can you see my triangle? My triangle then is that, and I label that welfare gain. Okay? Right, so that's our welfare gain triangle. Now, let's try and figure out what would happen if I subsidized this particular industry. So we're depicting this as the renewable energy market. And in terms of a subsidy diagram, the equilibrium that we are initially operating at, which is QEP, that's the equilibrium the government is not happy with. They want more of this particular good produced or more of it consumed. And the amount they actually want is called that, Q star, social optimum, right there. So therefore, what I need to do is I need to shift the supply curve outwards to achieve that equilibrium. Now, the supply curve in an externality is your MPC curve, marginal private cost, okay? And marginal private cost will now be shifted. How do I shift it? I go up from Q star exactly to the point where I hit marginal private benefit, because marginal private benefit is basically the demand curve. And I need to make sure that the supply equals demand exactly at the quantity where the government wants us to be at, which is Q star. So I am going to shift my MPC curve right here, and I get MPC plus subsidy. Okay, so hopefully that's on the screen. MPC plus subsidy. Now, the last thing that I need to do is, can you see that I also need to depict the new price, because the equilibrium is now changed. I can dot across and call that P2. And voila, my diagram is absolutely done. Yeah, cool. So that's another diagram that we could then have drawn. Now, when we have drawn that and we talk about how it shifts MPC out, causing the price to fall to P2, we can then talk about the external benefits that would arise from them doing what they're doing, which is renewable energy. Well, there'll be less strain on the NHS. That's one. Worker productivity in the economy is likely to go up because obviously if the energy that we're using is less pollutant, there'll be less people getting sick. Another thing that you could talk about is that certain industries like fishing are better off, because if pollution levels fall, then there's more fish alive. You get the point, right? Don't go on a crazy geography tangent, but you can make a couple of points there to help develop your particular answer. So that was the second micro point that I could have made. And in case, for example, you get it in paper 1, the micro paper is a 25 marker, you may want to split it between the basic analysis, which was the normal subsidy diagram, and then you could do an externality diagram as the second analysis. The very final diagram which I won't draw just yet because I am probably going to do questions on this later, is cost and revenue diagram. From the perspective of a firm, a subsidy causes MC and AC to shift down because it's essentially like a variable cost going down. The government is basically giving you money to produce goods, so it's cheaper for you to produce your goods. There is a past paper question. If I remember correctly, I think it's June 2015, Unit 3. It was in relation to baby formula milk in China. And the 12 marker was to assess the effect of government subsidies to Chinese manufacturers. And it asked you to draw a cost and revenue diagram. And that would have been the diagram you drew, which is costs going down, MC going down, and AC going down as well. Okay? Right. I haven't had a chance to look at your comments yet. I will in a sec. Before that, though, let's evaluate. Because we've done a fairly in-depth analysis for the macroeconomic effects of a subsidy. One of the questions I typically get is something along the lines of, do you need to evaluate micro points with micro points? Or can you evaluate it with a macro point? The answer is it's very fluid, and therefore you can evaluate a micro point with a macro point. More often than not, you'll probably find that a bit more complicated and a bit more difficult to do, but from time to time that makes sense. In this particular sense, there isn't really a need. It's a point that actually overlaps both into micro and into macro. And it's the one evaluation that I fully expect you to lead with on a subsidy question, which is, it creates a dependency culture amongst producers. If producers become overly reliant on the subsidy, then the issue that arises is that they can become, in order for us to flesh it out a little bit more, they can become X inefficient. X inefficiency is basically where a firm is incurring unnecessarily high costs due to a lack of competition. They're just lazy. So you're likely to see a fall in the quality of the goods, a fall in the level of investment. The firms may not necessarily reinvest the money. They might just pocket the subsidy. So that could be fairly easily developed into a fairly, pretty good point there. Okay, so that's our evaluation on the micro side. Now, in terms of macro, there are some really easy points. And this is the thing that I want to press, is that often micro concepts come up in macro and macro concepts come up in micro. And it's inevitable sometimes that they overlap. And often the points that you're making are fairly similar, but the end game, the end kind of point that you make will be different. The easiest point, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of a macro point for subsidies, if the government is subsidizing firms, that would make them more internationally price competitive. Simple as that. And that opens up an absolute avalanche of points. Because of that trigger of them becoming more price competitive, we can do the following. So the first point that I would make straight away is, therefore, the level of exports going out of the country, whatever country is that's doing the renewable energy subsidizing, so let's say the UK, would increase as British goods, in this case, would become more internationally price competitive and thus attractive to consumers in other countries. So exports will go up. At the same time, by the way, imports are going to fall. The reason why imports will fall is because why would I need to buy anything from abroad? I can continue to just buy it from the domestic market because it's cheaper in my domestic economy. Therefore, exports go up and imports will go down. First point, in terms of our chain, exports are going up, imports are going down. What is happening to our current account deficit? Well, our current account deficit is therefore likely to shrink. It's going to get better because we're exporting more and we're importing less. One. From that, we can then say the following. Exports minus imports are also a component of AD. Therefore, if exports are going up and imports are going down, AD will shift outwards. At the same time, as part of the development, again, because this is 25 marker, I need depth. At the same time, exports are an injection into the circular flow of income. Therefore, there will be a positive multiplier effect. You would define what a multiplier is. You can even explain it in a 25 marker. You say something along the lines of, as firms are making more profits, they can hire more workers. Those workers will increase their consumption levels. Other firms will make more profits and hire more workers, and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, that chain of reasoning is fairly in-depth now. And the next thing that I would do is I would draw LRIS and AD. And you can show off. The reason why you can show off is because, given that you've spoken about the positive multiplier effect, you can shift the aggregate demand curve outwards, not once, but twice. So I normally draw the Keynesian LRIS curve. If you draw classical, it's not the end of the world, you can. I just feel like the Keynesian one, there's more going on. So I definitely would do that. Okay, so we've got, let me just do real output on the x-axis and price level on the y-axis, and we've got the following. Okay, so that's not the nicest LRIS curve in the world, but it will do. And let's say my AD curve was initially there, AD1, AD2, and then AD3. Right. Obviously, you need to label your equilibriums. Y1, Y2, Y3. The most common error on the exam report is that students label this as Q. It is not. Real GDP and real output is depicted by the letter Y. And obviously, you do your prices as well. I'm just being a bit lazy. So P1, let's do it. P2, P3. Okay. Now, once you've done that, the key in any economics exam that you're doing is whenever you draw a diagram, you're expected to comment on it. In order for you to be credited fully, in order for you to develop it properly, you need to now comment on it. And with macro diagrams, the way that you comment on macro diagrams is you go through the macroeconomic objectives. Because in essence, that's what this basically will be showing us. Well, number one, what happened to economic growth? Well, economic growth went up from Y1 to Y3. So one of the points that I would always say as part of that, if I wanted to develop it a little bit more in 25 marker, is if there is an increase in economic growth, living standards in the economy tend to rise. So that's number one. Another thing that happens is the level of unemployment is falling as the economy gets closer to full capacity. We're getting closer to the point where LRIS becomes perfectly inelastic. So therefore, there's more jobs created. And again, I could develop that more by talking about how if firms that are selling renewable energy are making more profits, they are in a position to hire more workers. Okay, and they're going to need more workers as well to cater to the demand. Another thing that I could describe here is the government is likely to generate more revenue because their incomes are going up. There'll be more tax revenue. They'll be spending less on unemployment benefits. Now, this is a bit too much, by the way, just so you're aware. I'm purposely making more points than you're expected to make, but it means that you have a kind of an assortment of different points that you could choose from, and then you could develop it accordingly. It doesn't need you to go through all of them. So if I did the government point, I could talk about how the fiscal deficit for the UK therefore would shrink, national debt would therefore shrink. Simple as that, okay? That's my analysis. Right, eval. There are a couple of evaluations, and for the purpose of this 2-hour session, I obviously can't go through every single thing. So I will do my absolute best to go through what I think are the best ones or the easiest ones to develop. A really clever thing to understand is where subsidies lies in your course. Subsidies actually comes up in your course, both AQA, OCR, EdXL, all of you guys, in 2 places. Now you definitely know it from theme 1 because that's where you go into it in a lot of depth. So what I drew earlier with the supply and demand, that's a theme 1 diagram. But it also comes up in theme 4. Where does it come up in theme 4? In theme 4, this is a form of protectionism. So a really easy point that I could make is twofold. The first is that if this is a form of protectionism, other countries may retaliate. So we're talking about how our exports are going to go up and imports will go down. But other countries may retaliate by either subsidizing their own farmers, the renewable energy firms, or they might start to impose tariffs on you. One of the topics that I definitely want to go through today, because I think it will come up, is protectionism and how you deal with the protectionism question. But just for the purpose of this particular essay, if a country imposes a tariff on us because they feel that this particular protectionist policy is unfair, our exports may not necessarily go up. In fact, what it may trigger then is a trade war, such as the one that's going on between the US and China, which I think will be your question. I have no idea, but who knows, right? If that were to happen, then actually your current account may not necessarily get better. It could even get worse if the demand for your imports, so your consumers in your domestic economy have inelastic demand, whereas the demand for your exports are elastic, you'd be worse off if there was a trade war. So that's one evaluation. Another evaluation that I could do here is the fact that the WTO may step in. If you remember the World Trade Organization, which most countries are, they may step in and be like, no, you're not allowed to subsidize these firms because that goes against the rules. That goes against, having free trade. So those are 2 points that in one paragraph interlink significantly, and I would kind of go with that, okay? Now, judgment. A question like this, it's not the easiest thing to do. A judgment for me has 3 key features. The first key feature of a judgment is that you very clearly state whether you agree or disagree if the statement is like, is this better than that? Or how effective is this? You go, oh, it is effective, or it's not effective, or in isolation, it is not effective, but with this, it is effective. The second thing that a good judgment will do is you prioritize amongst your points. You essentially tell the examiner how you arrived at that judgment based on 1 or 2 of the points that you made in the essay thus far. Don't throw in new points if you can avoid it at this point. It's better to not to. And then third is that you can actually provide the government with policy advice, which is a skill that requires a bit of practice, and it's not always an option. So a question like this, you kind of can, but you kind of can't. So what I would say is something along the lines of, on the balance of evidence, subsidizing renewable energy should yield long-term benefits for the economy. In particular, on a micro level, it is likely to result in more profits for firms, and on a macro level can help to reduce a country's current account deficit and achieve economic growth. Okay? The government should therefore subsidize these firms, but ensure that they monitor how they do in order to avoid the firms becoming overly dependent and the quality of the goods declining. That's my judgment, okay? I get a nice 25 out of 25 and I move on, okay? Cool, so that's our first 25 marker that I wanted to go through. Right, I am gonna read some of your questions. Okay. Okay, so someone was asking, by the way, about with the diagram for a subsidy, whether I shift supply inwards. No, I always shift supply outwards. A reduction in costs of production would mean that it's easier for me to supply more to the market. Therefore, supply shifts outwards, always. Subsidy, always, supply shifting outwards, okay? Right, I will get through some of the questions that have been posted on the YouTube channel. I think my YouTube channel might even, well, the one on my screen over here might be stuck. I hope yours is not. But what I want to go through is other topics that I was asked in advance. And one of the topics is the price mechanism, which is a theme 1 concept. So let's just quickly recap. In a free market, there is no government intervention whatsoever, and goods will be allocated through something called the price mechanism. Price mechanism is just a really, really fancy way of saying supply and demand. But what you have to understand is that there are 3 functions of prices. There are 3 things that prices do that helps us to allocate resources in a free market economy. Now, if I were you, for sure, I would be looking at June 2016, the AS paper, the very first edition of the new spec for EdXL. They had a 15 marker, which a lot of people found really, really horrible. It said something to the extent of determine how the price mechanism can allocate housing in the UK. Okay, as a 15 marker, that's not too lovely. But you have to understand 2 things. One is whenever a question like that comes up, one is that they're normally a bit more lenient on the mark scheme and the way that they kind of mark it if they know that it's a particularly difficult question, because most people in the country will find it really difficult. But 2 is that you kind of just take a step back and think, okay, what's everything that I know about the price mechanism? So before I go through how you might want to approach a question like that, what I want to do is to go through the 3 functions of the price mechanism, okay? So, number 1, the first function of the price mechanism is something called signaling. Now, signaling, the idea is this. If I am a farm and I produce, let's say, potatoes, hypothetically, if I was selling my potatoes at a price of £1, and then at the end of the month, I had excess supply, I had a surplus, I had potatoes left over that I hadn't sold, well, that signals to me that my price is too high. Therefore, if I bring my price back down, people will buy more of my potatoes and I can get rid of my excess. So that's one way. Another one is excess demand. For example, if I sell all of my potatoes, but people are calling me up going, oh, do you have more potatoes? That again signals to me that my price is too low. Therefore, I need to raise my price. And that's how we end up at equilibrium. It's not, it's not magic. It's trial and error, basically. So that's the first price mechanism. The second function of prices is something called rationing. Rationing is basically the idea that goods go to whoever is willing to pay the most for a particular good. So hypothetically, let's say that there's like a famine and like I can't grow any more potatoes, like very few potatoes get grown on an annual basis. That would make potatoes extremely scarce and the supply curve would shift inwards. The way that the good is therefore rationed is the price would go up, and only those people who are able to pay this higher price are going to get their hands on the potatoes. So the more scarce a good is, typically the higher the price is, because it's a bit like an auction whereby only those people who are willing to pay the higher prices will get that particular good. The third function of prices is the easiest, which is the incentive function. The incentive function is the idea that prices act to incentivize consumers and producers. So for example, let's say that if I had that call and people were like, oh, can you make more potatoes? We really want to get more potatoes. I only do so if prices go up. And I know that people are willing to pay a higher price because there's excess demand. So the idea is that the higher price acts as the incentive to make me want to produce more potatoes. Similarly, if the price of an item goes down, that provides an incentive for consumers to potentially buy more of it because it's cheaper. Now, I can actually depict all 3 of these in a kind of step-by-step approach on a diagram. So I will try and do this as slowly as possible. I know some of you messaged saying, can I repeat something? didn't see what it is that you messaged me. But this video will go, I believe it will be posted on our YouTube channel and on, I think on Facebook too. So you can rewind at the end and look back. It's just the judgment, I think it was, that you missed, so don't worry about it. But let's go through the price mechanism in terms of a diagram, and then I'll briefly discuss my approach, or what I think is a good approach to the question that they asked in June 2016. So in terms of the market, so let's say this is the market for potatoes, like I said. This is supply, this is demand. And let's say the initial equilibrium we are operating at is this. So I've got P1, Q1, just a standard equilibrium. And then for some reason, potatoes become really popular. People really, really want to eat potatoes. Therefore, the demand curve would shift outwards. So nice, easy outward shift of demand, D2. Okay, now be aware of the fact that initially the producer won't know this. It's not like someone suddenly goes up to you and goes, oh, by the way, the demand curve shifted, raise your price. What would initially happen is they continue to sell their good at a price of P1. But now you notice that it hits the supply curve still at that point where Q1 is, but I can now dot across to the new demand curve. So I've got this quantity, which I'm going to call, just for the sake of like making this easier, 1.5, because it's not actually an equilibrium, it's where we are currently kind of in the interim. Okay, so the number of units that are demanded are 1.5, whereas the number of units that are actually being produced or supplied are Q1. Okay, now I obviously now have excess demand because I'm getting calls and people are going, oh, do you have more potatoes? That is the first mechanism kicking in, which is the signaling function. The fact that I have excess, now the signal to me is that my price is too low. There's excess demand. Therefore, what do I start to do? I start to raise my price. I have an incentive now to sell more of this good, because as I move along my supply curve, so as I extend my supply curve and move in this direction, right, I'm getting a higher price. Therefore, I have a greater incentive to make this good, up until the point where I don't have any more excess. So I will keep selling and selling and selling at a higher price up until the point where I reach this, which is where supply now intersects demand, which we're going to call P2, Q2. Okay, P2, Q2. Now, you'll notice, by the way, that Q2 is less than Q1.5, which is an interesting concept. So we've got signaling happen first because there's excess demand, and therefore I have an indication that people are willing to pay a higher price because there's excess. The second thing that happens is I have an incentive to make more of the good, because as the price is higher, I'll make more profit. Therefore, I want to make more of this good. So I start to move along my supply curve. There's an extension along my supply curve. The very final thing that happens is the rationing function, which is at the new price of P2, only Q2 units are actually consumed. Why not 1.5? Because some people are priced out of the market. Those people that were willing to buy it at P1, they may not be willing, some of them, to pay P2. So the three functions of prices again. One, signaling. It signaled to me that my price was too low. Two, the incentive function kicked in because I have an incentive to make more because I make more money. And number three, the good eventually gets rationed on the basis of whoever is willing to pay the most for the good, they now get the good. So that, in essence, in one diagram, explains the three functions of prices. Now, how do you go about answering the question in June 2016? Well, they gave you several bits of information and data. One of them was showing house prices rising, particularly in London. And one of the things that you would therefore say is, if prices are rising, that may be due to excess demand signaling to the producer that prices are too low and people are willing to pay a higher price. So that leads to the price going up because there's a greater incentive for producers to make houses, basically, to sell houses. It's also going to provide them with an incentive because of the profit motive. They want to make more profit, and so they'll basically go and sell more houses. Yeah. It could also be because demand has shifted outwards. So if demand has shifted outwards, I can draw that, which I just drew a second ago. And I talk about how initially this leads to excess demand, and therefore that whole thing that I went through, the whole spiel, again, we can go through that and talk about how that relates to housing, excess demand, then it incentivizes, and then it rations the housing. The evaluation. The evaluation was to do with a figure which showed you the PES, which is the price elasticity of supply. In other words, how easily you can increase your supply of a particular item. Well, housing is likely to be very, very inelastic in supply, especially in areas like London. because there's not much land available to grow houses. Plus, it takes quite a long time to grow a house, or build a house, I guess, not grow a house, right? Therefore, the evaluation is, even though there's an incentive to make more housing, it may not be possible. Therefore, despite the fact that producers know they can charge a really, really high price, they may not be in a position to actually scale up their production and make more sales and utilize the current market conditions. So that could be a potential point that you can make as well as an evaluation. Yeah. Another analysis that you could talk about is how if house prices are high in London, it may provide an incentive for firms to kind of focus their attention on London because of the profit motive again. Therefore, you're likely to see more house building projects in London if that's possible. I know that kind of contradicts the evaluation of it not being possible because of land and the lack of land, but it's okay, it's valid, okay? Now, the evaluation that you could do here, because you kind of run out, there's not enormous amounts of things to say here. One of the easy points that you could talk about is in a price mechanism, free market, if the price increase is caused by an inward shift of supply, because let's say, for example, the costs of production have gone up, wage costs have gone up, whatever, planning permission might be harder to get. The problem with that is that it would also worsen income inequality. And the reason why it would worsen income inequality is because now you price out low-income households who can't afford this. If it were caused by an outward shift of demand, that might be caused because people's incomes are going up and they can afford more housing. It's fine. But if it's an inward shift of supply, the problem with an inward shift of supply is that the price has gone up, not because incomes have gone up or because demand has gone up, but because of the fact that actually in this situation, the costs of production have gone up, and so very few people can afford to buy houses. Okay, so hopefully that kind of clarifies that a little bit. Okay, right, a couple of things. Very, very brief topics, and then we will go through a bigger topic. The next big topic that I want to go through is price discrimination in terms of what it is and how you would answer a question and what I predict could be a question that they could ask on price discrimination. Before that, I've just seen someone ask a question about interest rates, so let's just go through that really briefly. Not to overly plug our services, but on our YouTube page, some of you may be new to our YouTube channel, but on our YouTube channel, there are a few videos, not too many, but we're going to have more soon, hopefully. One of the videos is a pretty long 18-minute video on monetary policy, which I very highly recommend you watch because it does go through interest rates in a lot of depth, but very, very straightforward. Interest rates is this. If I go to the bank and I put money in a bank, the transaction that's taking place is that I am essentially lending money to the bank. So when I put money in a bank, they're not going to just sit there waiting for me to come back and collect my money. They're going to invest it and do all sorts of things with it. So how would a bank like Halifax or HSBC incentivize you to put the money in their account rather than another bank? Well, it's through the interest rate. So in other words, if you put, let's say, £100 in your account, if the interest rate was 1% on that account, which is a pretty good interest rate to be honest for a current account, but whatever, then you would get £101 if you leave it in the account for a certain amount of time, okay? So that's one way to think about interest rates. The other way of thinking about interest rates is the cost of borrowing. So if I go into a bank and I ask for a loan, what will happen is this, is that they will give me a loan, provided that they think I'm worthy of getting the loan. And they will say to me, look, you need to pay back that money. So let's say, I don't know, £1,000 plus the interest rate. So let's say the interest rate was 4%. That means I take £1,000 and I have to pay that back plus 4% interest, so £40 on top of it. That's it. That's what interest rates are, okay? So it's imperative that you understand what an interest rate is because it's one of those concepts that you need to be able to kind of bring into an essay. Especially if it's things like quantitative easing, etc. I will try if I get time to go through stuff like that, but it's not the highest on my agenda of things that I want to cover in the next hour and 10 minutes or so that we have. Okay, cool. So next, price discrimination. Price discrimination. The starting point is to understand what price discrimination actually is. You've heard of the term, but do you know how to define price discrimination? Price discrimination is essentially where a firm charges different consumers, different prices for the exact same good, okay? A really good example of price discrimination in terms of real world knowledge is the cinema. So if you were to go to the cinema, like View, typically you're gonna get charged as a student a lower rate than I get charged, and that is all to do with the PEDs, okay? So firstly, I wanna go through an existing question, and then I will go through what I think could be a potential question that they could ask about price discrimination. First, the question that has been asked as a data response, it has only come up once in the edXL paper. It came up in the June 2017 paper as a 15 and 25, for those of you that are AQA, by the way. And in terms of the question for EdXL, it was June 2014. Okay, so June 2014, question 10C. Has a question about Jessop's, which is a camera shop, for those of you that don't know. And the question, to paraphrase, said something along the lines of, assess whether price discrimination is possible, both in-store and online for a company such as Jessop's, something like that, okay? Right, let's talk about how you would construct an answer to that, because in all honesty, that's not the easiest question in the world. Number one, the first thing that you need to do is understand that there are 3 conditions that need to be satisfied in order for a firm to be able to actually price discriminate. The first condition is fairly straightforward, but you need to find data evidence to support that point. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to say the theoretical points to the knowledge mark, and then I will contextualize it through June 2014 10C, okay? So the knowledge mark, the first condition that needs to be satisfied for a firm to be able to price discriminate is that they have to have a degree of monopoly power. Now, to be very clear, when I say monopoly power, I don't mean that they have to be a monopoly. There's a big difference between the two. Monopoly power is just a fancy way of saying that they have price setting capability, that they are able to actually set a price. So even barbers, by the way, so like in monopolistic competition, they have some degree of price setting capability, not very high, but they do have some monopoly power, okay? Now, oligopolies and monopolies are gonna have a very high degree of monopoly power because they have things like brand loyalty and you know, they've got market share, blah, 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 yeah? So, my first point is, yes, it's possible for a firm like Jessop's to price discriminate because they do have a degree of monopoly power. Now, the evidence that you're going to be looking out for in the data to help support that particular point are the following. 1, is it an established name in the market? Do they have brand loyalty? Now, the way that you can determine whether a firm has brand loyalty is often if you recognize the name yourself. Normally that would suggest they have brand loyalty. Another is the indicator is the text, the market share they have, right? They'll say in the data, there'll be certain things that they have. So for example, let's say you've never heard of Jessop's in your whole life. One of the things that it mentions in the data is Peter Jones, who's from Dragon's Den, talking about how it's an iconic British firm. I would quote that. I would literally have that and quotation marks and go, it's an iconic British firm according to Peter Jones. Therefore, that suggests that they have a degree of monopoly power. They have some element of price setting capability. Another thing that I'd be looking out for that would tell me that a firm does have market power or price setting capability is their market share. So it might give you the concentration ratio. It might tell you how much of the market this particular firm has. I think if I remember correctly, it says something like they expect to take 15% of the single lens market. I would quote that as well. And I go, oh, look, that's quite sizable. Therefore, they are likely to set prices. The other thing that I would look out for, and sometimes it's more subtle, is if they have things like, are they advertising? Have they got exposure in terms of, you know, doing TV adverts, billboards, whatever it might be? A really clever evaluation that was accepted on the mark scheme for that paper was they had an image at the top of that particular extract, and it was Peter Jones. So those of you that have seen Dragon's Den, hopefully you'll, recognize him. Peter Jones is really famous. He is probably the most famous of the dragons on Dragon's Den. An amazing point that you could have made to determine how they have monopoly power is to say that he is like a brand. Their association with Peter Jones gives them a higher degree of monopoly power. So that could be one really detailed paragraph, let's say if it was a 15 marker, okay? I'm gonna go through all the analyses first, all the conditions. So those of you that are AQA for a 15 marker, you don't need to evaluate. So you just go through the analyses and happy days for you. Those of you that are at Excel, you do need to evaluate. So go through the evaluations as well. The second condition that needs to be satisfied in order for a firm to be able to price discriminate is that they need to be able to separate the market into sub-markets, yeah? Because there's no point in setting different prices if everyone has the same PED for the good. The whole point of why they set a higher price for adults in the cinema is that the PED for adults is more inelastic. We assume that adults are likely to have an income compared to students, and therefore they can charge a higher price to the adults and a lower price to the students, okay? So therefore, can they separate the market? Well, in the Jessop's question, it was open-ended, and pretty much it was open-ended for a good reason, because it gives you the option of going through 2 ways, and I would do both. One way that they can price discriminate is between online and in-store. Now, can you figure out whether the online price should be theoretically lower or higher? Well, online, it's going to be more elastic. And the reason why it's more elastic is because it's so much easier for you to buy other cameras or to switch to another website. You literally just click new tab, I don't know, go to Amazon or something and you buy another camera. Whereas if you're in store, you're already there. Like physically to have to move from one store and go to another store, there's a lot more effort involved. Therefore, you'd argue that in store, it's more price inelastic compared to online where it's more price elastic. Therefore, theoretically, they should be able to charge a lower price online and a higher price in store. That's one way they can price discriminate. The other thing that we can say is that they can price discriminate both online and in store. And the easiest way always, and always use this as your example, is to say that they can offer student discounts. So for example, Apple offers student discounts, loads of firms offer student discounts. And therefore I would go, well, students are likely to have an elastic PED because they have limited income. Therefore, the prices for students will be lower, prices for the producer, so for the adult will be higher, okay? 2. And I would use the diagram to support that as well. Just because we're a little bit short on time, I was meant to end at 9, but I'm happy to stay till about 9:15. And I'll do a couple of little things like the diagram. So I'll note that down somewhere. And I'll go through the price discrimination diagram at 9:05. Okay? Anyways, so that's our second reason as to why they can price discriminate. Third reason why they are able to price discriminate is the cost of policing the scheme. So in other words, this is the condition. The cost of enforcing and making sure that the submarkets are kept separate must be lower than the additional profits you would gain from price discriminating. So for example, how do they enforce a student discount? Well, if you go in store and you wanted to buy a camera from Jessop's and they were offering a student discount, you have to show your ID. Does that cost Jessop's anything to ask you to show your ID? No, it's completely free. It's like a 5-second transaction. You go, can I see your ID? They say yes. You literally go, okay, here is your discount. If they don't have their ID, they don't get the discount. Even if they look like a student, it doesn't matter. They don't get a discount. Therefore, is it easy to police and enforce that the submarkets are kept separate? Yeah, it is. Therefore, it is possible for them to be able to price discriminate. Okay? Those are our 3 things. Now, at Excel, you only need to do 2 really well-developed analyses for a 15 marker and 2 well-developed evaluations. So I would probably do the first 2, to be honest. And probably you can even merge the last one, by the way, into the one about PEDs. Kind of include that as well, but like as a smaller point. Evaluations. The evaluations are why it may not be possible for you to be able to price discriminate. The first reason why you may not be able to price discriminate is because actually a market like this, there is very likely to be something called seepage. Seepage is just a really fancy way of saying infiltration between the submarkets. How would that happen? Well, in store, let's say you had a student discount and your parents wanted to buy a camera. What would make sense for them to do? They get you to go buy it because they literally give you the money, but they get the student discount because you're going to go and buy it on their behalf. Therefore, the firm could potentially be losing money because of that. So that's number 1. Now, seepage is way more likely to occur online, and this is generally always the case. Why? Because online, when you're purchasing something, and let's say you have like an ID card, like a NUS card, a student card, just type in the number, and then the discount is applied. They have no way of knowing who's behind the screen actually applying that discount code. Therefore, it's much easier for you to be able to do something like that in online, right? So seepage is very, very likely to occur in an industry like this, okay? That's my first evaluation as to why actually it may not make sense for them to price discriminate. Second evaluation on the mark scheme, I think is the best point by miles. It is such a clever point. And in order for me to explain the point, I just want to go on a quick tangent. January 2013 had a multiple choice question which said the following. Which of the following is an example of 3rd degree price discrimination? The most commonly selected answer that year, which was incorrect, was students chose a business class seat and an economy class seat on the same flight. Why is that not price discrimination? Because although you are on the same flight, it is a completely different service. So someone sitting in first class isn't getting the same service as someone sitting in economy class. That therefore is not price discrimination. That is what we call product differentiation. If I look at it from the perspective of one of my points, which was I said, look, they can price discriminate by setting a lower price online and a higher price in store. You can make the case that actually, if they were charging different prices, it isn't because of price discrimination. Because in store, there are several things that you get that you don't get online. And the extract bangs on about this, by the way. The extract keeps talking about how you have like an amazing experience. It's a really Apple-ish kind of vibe where you can go and try the cameras out. You get an expert that answers your questions. You can get calendars produced live there and then. Blah, 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 blah. The point is then, is in store, you're getting more of a service than you are online. And therefore, if they're charging different prices between online and in store, it isn't because of price discrimination. It is because of product differentiation. That is such a clever point. Another one that you could talk about, by the way, is the fact that perhaps the prices are different, again, not because of price discrimination, but because of cost factors. So for example, the cost of setting up and maintaining a website is likely to be a lot lower than the cost of having a shop, especially in really like expensive areas like, you know, Regent Street or Oxford Circus, Oxford Street, which is where they were basically launching their flagship store in the extract. Well, there's major costs there. You've got major rent, you've got wages to staff, you've got electricity bills, blah, 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 blah. So all of those cost factors could be the reasons why the prices in store are higher compared to online, rather than it actually being a case of price discrimination. Yeah? Nice and easy. Cool. Right. In terms of what I think the question could be and how I think they could word this to make it a little bit more difficult. If it were a 15 mark, again, AQA, you don't need evaluations. Those of you that are at Excel, we're going to go through this in depth so that you have analysis and evaluations. But now that you have an understanding of what price discrimination is and the conditions that need to be satisfied, that is an indicator of the type of points you can try and develop as part of your analysis. And the things that you would therefore say as evaluation could be, oh, but actually they might not be able to do this. So anyways, the question could be something along the lines of, assess the benefits to consumers and producers of a firm price discriminating and whatever the item is, okay? If they are asking that, so similar to last year, the 15 marker last year in June 2018 for paper 1 had what policies can governments and firms adopt to improve the mobility of labor? And you would get capped if you exclusively spoke about the government or exclusively spoke about firms. This would be an example of that. If they said, what are the benefits to consumers and producers of price discrimination? You should be dedicating a paragraph to consumer and a paragraph to producers. The harder one probably is the consumer. We'll deal with that in a sec. Let's start with the producer first. The producer is really straightforward. The whole point of them price discriminating is that by price discriminating, they will make more profits. I will draw the diagram. And again, I will draw the diagram just after 9 o'clock, just so that we can get through as much theory as possible. But I will draw the diagram and show that by price discriminating, the firm extracts more profits and they convert consumer surplus into producer surplus. That's the whole point, is that if I can charge a higher price for those that are willing to pay a higher price, that means that I make more profits. And by charging a lower price to those that can't really afford the good, what that does is it increases my sales, and therefore, again, I make more profits that way. Now, with those higher profits, the benefit to the producer is they can invest the profits into R&D, they can come up with new innovative products, they become more dynamically efficient, etc., etc. But that paragraph should be fairly straightforward because you're going through the benefits to the producer in terms of their profits going up as a kind of consequence of them price discriminating and separating the markets. That's analysis. Evaluation. Evaluation is really straightforward, which is actually, if it's a market where there is likely to be seepage, or if there's arbitrage. Arbitrage is a fancy way of saying if someone buys something at a low price and sells it at a high price. So let's say hypothetically, if I were able to go buy cinema seats at the student rate, let's say £5, and I was able to sell it to an adult at £6, that would be arbitrage because I make £1 profit, but at the expense of the firm because that adult may have paid the adult price of £8, but now they're buying it off me. Now, in markets, typically, there is likely to be at least seepage. Seepage is usually a really easy point to develop. So for example, if it's Apple that are doing the price discrimination, well, seepage is likely to occur big time online. Like I said earlier, seepage is likely to occur big time in person because you can get someone who's a student to buy it on your behalf. You can buy it if you're a student on behalf of your parents, blah, 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 right? And you just flesh that out. And the point that you're making there then is that actually profits for the firm may fall on the back of price discrimination. Because if they are taken advantage of, and loads of, let's say, adults are now buying cameras or buying whatever it is that they're selling at the student rate, then in reality, despite the fact that the PED is inelastic, they're getting a low price at the expense of the firm. So one analysis, one evaluation. Second analysis, in terms of the consumer. Now, the difficulty is, how does this benefit the consumer? Like how can I talk about this as like a benefit to the consumer? There are two ways of doing this. The first is, well, those people that are getting the lower price, the students, if there were no price discrimination, typically the firm would have to charge kind of an average price between the best price for the consumer, so for the student, and the best price for the adult. So let's say hypothetically, if the adult price was £8 and the student was like £5, the firm might charge a price of, let's say, £6 if they didn't price discriminate. But if you're a consumer, you're not getting it at £5 when they do price discriminate, so your consumer surplus will go up. it's more allocative efficiency for you. You basically get more satisfaction, you get a better quality good, blah, blah, blah. But the other thing that you can easily link together is the fact that if firms have more profits and they invested into new technologies, they may also produce a wider range of goods. Apple being a great example of that. You could argue that by price discriminating and offering a lower price for students, that enables them to sell more to students. It enables them to make more profits from the adult market as well. And in doing so, they can provide a wider range of services for consumers. So Apple produced the Apple Watch, you've got what they called AirPods, you've got different types of Macs, iPads, you get the point, right? They produce a wide range of goods, which will therefore benefit the consumer as well. So that's the analysis in terms of the consumer. The evaluation for the consumer, again, is really straightforward, is the fact that, well, some consumers are now being charged a higher price and their consumer surplus is eroding. It's being turned into producer surplus. There's also a danger that actually the firm, by making more profits, will dominate the market so much that they become inefficient. They don't really care about investments. They don't really care about ensuring, because no one's going to be able to compete with a firm that has such a significant market share. If the firm starts to advertise, for example, the market becomes less contestable because that's a sunk cost. So you could easily develop points as to why the consumer might end up with less choice. Let's say the market becomes more oligopolistic. They can start pricing and moving competitors out of the market. Let's say that the consumer gets a lower quality good because the firm just becomes really complacent. It doesn't really care. That again, and an example of that again in terms of Apple is Apple are so dominant in the phone market now that they can get away with blatant exploitation of consumers. It was very recent that they announced, or they admitted, that the software updates that they kind of force your phone to do slows down older models. Well, that's not great for the consumer because it means that it's forcing me to go and buy the latest version of their phone, but not kind of willingly almost. It's because they've killed my phone off. Okay, get the gist. Bear in mind again that there will be clear points in the data as well that will help if this was a 15 marker for those of you that are at Excel that you can use as part of your development. Okay, cool. Right. So that's another particular topic that I think could come up. All right. A couple of you have asked about the Marshall Lerner condition. So let's go through the Marshall Lerner condition. In order to do that, though, let's make it a bit more interesting. Let's do the following question. So the question I'd like you to write down is as follows. Evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of a devaluation of Brazil's currency, the real. Okay, 25 marks. And can we very briefly talk about the difference between a depreciation and a devaluation? A depreciation is where a currency gets weaker, but it's through supply and demand. There is no intervention by the government or the central bank to get the exchange rate to be weaker. It just happened naturally. So either people were selling that particular currency in the foreign exchange market, or people were buying less of it. Let's say they had like high levels of inflation, less attractive. People don't want to buy their goods and services. Demand was shifting inwards. Yeah. Now, a devaluation, on the other hand, is where there is an active involvement by the central bank to weaken the currency. And it's very important that you understand how they do this. Now, the central bank cannot go around begging consumers to not buy their currency, nor can they go around begging producers or sellers, foreign exchange like traders, to not sell their currency. The only thing they can do is either they buy up the real, the currency themselves, or they sell it in the foreign exchange market. A very, very important concept for you to understand is something called foreign reserves. Foreign reserves are just a fancy way of saying other currencies in your economy. So for example, in the UK, foreign reserves would be things like dollars, yen, euros, rupees, yeah? And these are vital in an economy because I can use foreign reserves as a means of manipulating my exchange rate if I need to do that. So if I wanted to devalue the real, I, as the central bank of Brazil, what I would do is I would sell real in the foreign exchange market and I would buy up foreign reserves. And the way that I can depict that on a very basic supply and demand schedule is if I have quantity and let's say price of real on my y-axis, I'll show you guys this in a sec. I just draw a very simple supply and demand. And I think for any exchange rate question, I would very strongly recommend that you guys do this, that you draw it as a supply and demand. Well, look at what happens. If I sell my currency in the foreign exchange market, there's an increased supply of the real, causing the value of the currency to fall. In other words, I have devalued my currency. But I can't just sell my currency for nothing. I have to get something in return. And what am I getting in return? I'm getting foreign reserves in return. Okay, so that's A very brief thing that you might want to mention in the introduction. If you're running out of time, again, it's not very important, so I would not really be too freaked out by it, yeah? Again, I want macro, I want micro. I'm going to start with macro because this is a very macro type topic. And again, there is what I call like the trigger point. The trigger is that if you understand what the main point is, or the first chain of reasoning, it opens up everything else in the question. The trigger, again here, is that it would make Brazil's economy more price competitive. The reason why, again, watch that 80-minute video, but the idea is that you're price competitive if you're cheaper relative to other countries. So the two countries, or the country that I always want to remember in terms of being price competitive, China. Why do people buy Chinese goods? Because it's super cheap. So if you have a weaker currency, that means that your goods and services, relatively speaking, are now cheaper. So chain number one. Chain number one is that Brazil's economy will now become more price competitive. The chain from there on is exports will go up, and you explain why, because now other currencies can buy more real. Imports will fall. Why? Because it's more expensive for Brazilians to buy goods and services from the rest of the world. They'll have to convert more and more of their real to buy, let's say, $1, okay? Therefore, the current account deficit for Brazil would shrink. You could then develop that as a 25 marker by talking about X minus M being components of AD. AD would shift out, multiplier effect because exports are an injection, blah, blah, blah. It's exactly the same thing that I did earlier with them becoming more price competitive, okay? But the key thing here, after I draw ASAD and talk about economic growth and living standards, maybe unemployment, the key thing that I would always expect you to do is that whenever the question is an appreciation, a depreciation, a revaluation, which means they manipulated the exchange rate to make it stronger, or a devaluation, any of those, I don't care what happens, your evaluation 100% must be the Marshall-Lerner condition. The way that you word it is as follows. You say, however, for whatever happened in the analysis to happen, I wouldn't write like that. I'd say, however, for Brazil's currency, so current account, to improve following the devaluation of the real, the Marshall-Lerner condition must be satisfied. Okay? Now, let's talk about what the Marshall-Lerner condition is. You should write this down if you don't have it in your notes. And the Marshall-Lerner condition is as follows. Marshall-Lerner condition states that the sum of the price elasticities of imports and exports must be greater than 1. In other words, they have to be elastic for whatever we said in the analysis to actually happen. Even if the analysis, by the way, let's say the current account worsened because there was an appreciation or revaluation, this is still valid. You still say, oh, for that to happen, the Marshall-Lerner condition needs to be satisfied. Now, the best way to kind of understand the Marshall-Lerner condition, I feel, is to break it up into two parts. So let's break it up in terms of our exports, and then we'll deal with our imports second. In terms of our exports, think of it in terms of if you were to own like a shop. So let's say in your shop, you sell amazing mobile phones with this awesome expert tuition case, right? If I have a mobile phone company and I decide to reduce the price of my mobile phone, what will happen to demand? Obviously, it will go up, right? Like, that's not very difficult to know. If prices go down, demand will go up naturally. But that doesn't tell me whether or not I make more revenue. It doesn't tell me whether or not that's a good idea. What will determine whether I make more or less money is the price elasticity of demand for my mobile phones. Because if, for example, let's say that my price were reduced by 50%, I halve the price of my mobile phones, but I only get 3% extra demand. Am I better off or am I worse off? I'm worse off, because even though I get 3% more customers, everyone's paying half the amount they were paying before. I'm not making more money, I'm making less money. Well, in terms of our current account, when a currency depreciates or devalues, that is the exact same thing as us reducing the price of our mobile phones. All of our goods and services now are cheaper. So of course exports will go up naturally. But if exports only go up a tiny bit, in other words, if they are inelastic, then actually in a monetary sense, I am making less money, not more money. So if my exchange rate depreciated by 10%, that means everything that I'm selling is 10% cheaper. And the demand for my exports only went up by 1%, I'm not better off, I'm worse off. Yes, I'm selling 1% more, but everything I'm selling is 10% cheaper. Whereas if the demand for our exports were elastic, so for example, if my currency depreciated by 10% and the demand for my exports went up by 40%, then I would make more money, because despite the fact that my prices are cheaper, I'm getting way more sales. So that's on the export side of things. In terms of imports, well, when my currency is weaker, it's more expensive for me to buy goods and services from the rest of the world. Naturally then, I will demand less imports. Of course I will. But if I only demand a very small decrease, if there's only a tiny reduction in the number of imports that I buy from the rest of the world, I am spending more money than I was before on my imports. Again, if my currency depreciated by 10%, that means that everything that I'm buying is 10% more expensive. So obviously I'll reduce my consumption. I'll reduce my demand for imports. But if I only reduce my imports by 2%, I'm not better off. I'm worse off because it means I'm spending more in total, okay? Whereas on the other hand, if my imports are elastic, that means that a small change in the exchange rate, in other words, if my prices are now 10% more expensive because my currency depreciated, but my imports dramatically fall to like, I don't know, 50%. That means that although I'm spending more per unit, I'm buying a lot less, therefore I'm spending less overall. That's the martial learning condition in a nutshell. Yeah? Does that make sense? So that, in a nutshell, is why it needs to be elastic. Now, the wording is a bit stupid because they expect you to word it like that on the mark scheme. But in reality, it should be the average sum of imports and exports. Elasticities must be greater than 1. Because if I just do a really basic example, let's say that I write x equals, let's say 0.6 and m equals 0.5. Okay, so if the elasticity for my exports was 0.6 and the elasticity for my imports was 0.5, is the Marshall-Lerner condition satisfied? The temptation is to say yes, because when you add them up, you're like, oh, 1.1, yeah, great. But that's not true. It's not, because actually it's the average of the two. And the logic of why it's not satisfied is as follows. On my exports, because exports are inelastic, that means that if my currency depreciated by 10%, my demand would only go up by 6%. So if I just did very basic maths, if you don't understand what's going on in terms of maths, don't worry. It just means that demand isn't going up more than the change in the price or the change in the exchange rate. So my currency depreciated by 10%, my exports would go up by 6%. Am I better off or worse off? I'm worse off. I'm making less money than I was before, because although everything is significantly cheaper, I'm only getting a bit more demand. Imports are 0.5. Therefore, my currency depreciates. It means that I have to spend more to buy an imported good. So again, 10% is our example. So let's say now, everything that I buy is 10% more expensive. I will reduce my demand, but I will only reduce my demand for imports by 5%. Therefore, am I spending more or less on my imports? I'm spending more, because I only reduce my demand a little bit, but I pay significantly more per unit. Clear? Hopefully that makes sense. If that didn't make sense, please post a comment on the YouTube channel, and I will try my best to clarify any issues that you might have. So that's the first part of the evaluation, by the way. But the best thing about the Marshall-Lerner condition is that it comes as a pairing. And I always want you to do the next thing immediately after the Marshall-Lerner condition, which is to draw something called the J-curve. The J-curve basically illustrates how there's a lag. And this, by the way, is a second evaluation, but I want us to consider it as if it's one evaluation. You do them back to back, one after another. They come as like a pairing. The J-curve, on the y-axis, we're going to have the current account, which I'm just going to depict as CA, just for the sake of saving a bit of time. And we break it up into quadrants so that we've got positive and negative. So it looks a little bit like this, okay? And that's the positive territory, that's the negative territory, and then we've got time. Sorry, it's very hard to like coordinate my finger with the camera. Right, now, this is how you draw the J-curve. You start off with just doing a straight little line. So firstly, you determine whether the country has a deficit or a surplus. So Brazil has a deficit. Therefore, I'm going to start in the negative territory to depict the fact that they have a current account deficit. That's just a straight line. At that point, nothing is happening. Now, the best way to figure out how to draw this particular curve is whatever we said in the analysis, always, in the short run, the opposite will actually happen. So we said in our analysis that they become more price competitive, and therefore the current account deficit shrinks, it gets better. Therefore, when I draw this, I go, nope, the opposite. Whatever I said, the exact opposite happens first. So therefore, the current account is going to go down first, and then eventually it will go up. It'll start to get better. What's it called the J-curve? It looks like J. But the point is the way that you can make sure that you draw this curve correctly is you ask yourself the question, what did I say in the analysis happens to the current account? Whatever I said in the analysis, in the short run, the exact opposite will happen first, and then whatever I said eventually will happen. So if I had a question and I said the currency appreciates, let's say for Brazil, yeah? Let me redraw very quickly. If I said the currency appreciates for Brazil, my analysis would be, oh, they're less price competitive, exports are going to go down, imports are going to go up, and the current account deficit would worsen. Agreed? When I do the Marshall-Lerner condition, and I explain the Marshall-Lerner condition, and then I come to drawing the J curve, it's not going to give me a J anymore, it will be this. So I will draw, again, I start off at the negative territory, but then, that's meant to be a straight line, by the way, but then I said whatever you said in the analysis, the opposite happens first. So you said your current account deficit is going to get worse, okay? The opposite is it's going to get better. So it will go up first, and then it will come down. It looks sort of like an N. You don't really call it an N curve, it doesn't really have a name. But does that make sense? So the idea is that this diagram, and we're going to explain the theory behind it in a second, this diagram will illustrate that whatever you said in the analysis, in the short run, the opposite will happen first. And the reason why is because the Marshall-Lerner condition isn't satisfied. And there are two reasons why the Marshall-Lerner condition is unlikely to be satisfied. One, consumers exhibit habitual behavior. It takes a while for consumers to adjust their spending patterns. So for example, if I import loads of, I don't know, French croissants, because I really like French croissants, and then suddenly my currency, the pound, is depreciated, I would continue to buy the same amount of croissants or maybe reduce my demand a little bit. I don't dramatically reduce my demand because I'm in the habit of buying those goods from France regularly. So that's the first reason why the Marshall-Lerner condition isn't satisfied. The second reason is a really good one as well, which is that firms usually are tied into trade contracts, which means that they can't suddenly get out in the middle of it and go, oh, do you know what, our currency is weaker now. We don't want to buy as much from you. We want you to buy more of us. It doesn't work like that. Therefore, in the short run, are exports and imports elastic or inelastic? They're very, very likely to be inelastic. And the reason why they're likely to be inelastic is because you're tied into contracts and firms exhibit habitual behavior. Therefore, whatever you said in the analysis, in the short run, the J curve will illustrate that the opposite happens first. The current account deficit would worsen for Brazil because firms are tied into contracts, blah, blah, blah. Then it starts to improve. The reason why is because in the long run, contracts can be renegotiated. Consumers will eventually adjust their spending patterns to take into account, that it is more expensive, so you probably want to look for alternatives, blah, blah, blah. And therefore, whatever you said in the analysis eventually now starts to happen. Clear? Capiche? Right, so we have got the following. We've got our first analysis, macro, which is your more price competitive and all the effects on AD. And our first evaluation, really strong evaluations, Marshall-Lerner, J curve. Let's switch now very quickly to the micro side of things. The micro side of things, there are two ways of doing it. You could do bad things and evaluate them good things, or you could do good things and evaluate them bad things. It doesn't really matter, to be honest. So in terms of what I would have done, I would have talked about how, if they have become, if the currency is weaker, so if it's been devalued, firms typically import a lot of their raw materials. Therefore, if you're importing a lot of your raw materials, that means that your costs of production have gone up. If you're pressed for time, you can draw a very simple supply and demand diagram with supply shifting inwards to take into account the cost of production for the firm have increased, and therefore they'll have to charge a higher price. Hopefully not pressed for time, because you can draw a much more sophisticated diagram, which is you can construct a cost and revenue diagram and then shift MC and AC up. Because you'd argue that it's a variable cost. Why is it a variable cost? Because when I import my raw materials, I get to decide how much I import, right? Therefore, I would shift MC and AC up. Again, not to overly plug, but there is a video which is how to draw a cost and revenue diagram systematically, step by step. You really, really need to watch that video. So make sure that you know how to construct the diagrams, and then after you do that, you shift your MC curve up. Make sure you label the new equilibrium quantity and the new equilibrium price before you shift AC up as well, okay? But then once we've done that, there are tons of things that we can now talk about. The first thing that we can talk about is just describe the diagram and talk about how variable costs have gone up because costs of production have gone up. We can then say that the number of units consumed or the number of units sold will fall from Q1 to Q2. The price the firm will charge will increase from P1 to P2. The profit that firms will make will fall. Some firms may even be priced out entirely. They may shut down. And again, you can show off it's a 25 market. Therefore, you can say what the shutdown condition is. You go, oh, perhaps the average revenue for the firm, the price basically, is less than the average variable cost now. Therefore, they would shut down straight away. They'd leave the market. You could talk about how firms have less money to invest, and therefore they won't be as dynamically efficient. They can't invest into new technologies, etc., etc., etc. Yeah? Nice, easy analysis. If you felt in an exam that wasn't enough, and you're like, you know what, I can write a bit more and I've got more time, a really easy point that you can always make is the fact that labor, which is in theme 3, labor is derived demand. Therefore, if the prices are higher, consumers are buying less of the good. If they're buying less of the good, the firm doesn't have to hire as many workers. Demand for labor goes down. and therefore more jobs are lost, blah, 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 blah. Evaluation is now the good things, though. Well, the good things are, well, if you're more price competitive internationally, AR and MR are actually shifting outwards. You're getting potentially a higher price, but also more sales because people are willing to basically buy your goods and services. The second is that if your exchange rate is now weak, right? If your exchange rate is now weak, it may mean that certain industries that were struggling before because they were struggling to compete, let's say against like, I don't know, China because of how cheap China are, suddenly become more price competitive. And therefore they can compete against the Chinese firms. Another generic evaluation, by the way, that you might want to take into account is as a proportion of a firm's cost, how much of it would be accounted for by like their imported raw materials? Can they source their raw materials domestically? If, for example, we're dealing with Brazil, typically Brazil sell a lot of primary products, which are naturally sourced from Brazil, obviously. Therefore, for Brazilian firms, it may not be that big an issue. Actually, it would just be really good because they can sell more to the rest of the world. And that's the essay. Okay, and you can obviously just do a judgment, and the judgment could be something along the lines of the effects of a devaluation probably are beneficial, but only in the long run. In the short run, actually, it's probably bad because you are more likely to be tied into contracts. The current account might worsen, economic growth might fall, etc., etc., etc. Done? Cool. Right. Next, let's have a look at some of the questions, you guys. Okay. Wow. I've got like a million different things being asked. Kinder Bueno. Kinder Bueno is the best chocolate. What are you talking about? All right. Okay. Do you know what? Can I? Because we're really short on time. It's not to ignore your questions. I promise I will do my very best to arrange another one of these. Hopefully this isn't. Hopefully I get a bit better at doing them as well. But it's more because I think it's likely to come up. I feel like it's a topic that is extremely, extremely topical. It's all over the news. They write a paper a year in advance normally, and this was hot off the press last year. It's been going on for about 2 years now. And I feel that they are likely to give you an extract. I promise I don't know, and I promise that it's just completely based on what I think. I think they're likely to ask you a question about protectionism and a trade war that's ongoing between the US and China. The US is basically having a trade war with everyone. Like Donald Trump is putting up protectionist tariffs all over the place. So that's very topical, and there's a lot of data that they can therefore use. So the question could be something along the lines of, assess the impact or evaluate the impact on consumers and producers of a trade war between China and the US. Or it could be a more open-ended question, even though that first one was also very open-ended, by the way, which is analyze the economic effects of a trade war between China and the USA, okay? The most important thing to understand, if it's worded like that, is that it allows you to talk about it from the perspective of both China, in terms of their exporters and potentially their consumers, and also the US in terms of their consumers and their producers, okay? Someone was asking me, by the way, about didn't protectionism come up last year? Not as a big question, not as far as I know. They briefly mentioned it, and actually the question said, apart from protectionism, what policies could the government use to kind of combat the issues of globalization? So it was kind of mentioned, but it wasn't really like a big question. They didn't actually go into it in any real depth, okay? Right, so the way that we're going to do this is we're going to assume that the USA have imposed a tariff on Chinese firms because they have accused them of dumping, especially things like solar panels. The EU, by the way, also did this at one point, so it could also be the EU. But I would have my first analysis as the effect on US consumers or the US economy of them imposing a trade barrier, which is like a tariff, okay? And in order for us to do that, we need to have a very, very systematic approach to constructing the diagram. So you need to know how to draw a tariff diagram. I really, really would pay attention if I were you. So the tariff diagram looks something like this. I will try my best to make this relatively neatish. So we've got price and quantity. Can everyone can see that? Okay, price and quantity. Starting point is drawing a very simple supply and demand. Now, normally when we draw supply and demand for a tariff diagram, we would label the supply curve and the demand curve as little subscript domestic to take into account like the domestic consumers. A really kind of geeky thing to do, why not, is if you know the country that's imposing the tariff, just write the country. So if it's the EU, you'd write the EU. I know it's not a country. But if it's the USA, you'd write the USA. So I'm going to write USA USA. I'm going to change pen because this pen's rubbish. Okay, so far my diagram looks like this. I've got supply, that's meant to say USA. I don't know if it's clear or not. And demand, USA. Yeah? Now, one of the key assumptions in a tariff diagram is that firms necessarily are price takers. Why? Because if we have loads of choice, I can buy this particular item from anywhere around the world. If you try to charge me a higher price, I just simply buy it from somewhere else, and therefore you can't. You can't get away with charging anything other than the market price that we assume is the world price, okay? And we will always set the world price below the equilibrium because we want to make sure that this country is importing this good, because a tariff is a tax on imports. So I'm going to set a perfectly elastic world supply just below the equilibrium, something like that, okay? So I've got WP1 and I label that as world supply, okay? Now, it's very important to know that whenever you have a price in economics, in theme one, any theme, you dot across from there until you hit the supply curve and the demand curve to determine how much is being supplied and demanded. Unless obviously it's like equilibrium, in which case they equal each other. In my market over here, can you see that at that world price, the amount of units that are supplied is just over here, Q1. Okay, Q1. Now, is that a high quantity or a low quantity? Well, clearly that is a very, very low quantity. And the logic underpinning that is that at the world price, producers in our economy in the USA think this isn't really worth it. I don't really want to sell much of this good because it's so cheap. On the other end is the demand, which is at Q2, which is really, really high because consumers go, oh, wow, you know what? This is really cheap. I want to buy loads of this good. Now, if you're in America and you demand Q2 units, but only Q1 units are being provided for by US firms, what do you do? Or how do you get those items? You go and buy it from the rest of the world. In other words, the distance between what you actually want, Q2, and what is being supplied in the market, Q1, is the level of imports. Because I go and buy this particular good from somewhere else in the world, okay? So my level of imports are depicted by that distance there. With me so far? Cool. The next thing that now happens, exactly as like you do in a tax diagram in theme one, is the supply curve would shift for the world. Why for the world? Because now whenever a firm or a particular like country wants to to export into your country, they have to now pay a tax. So therefore, world supply would shift upwards, and I get world supply plus tariff, and the world price will increase to WP2. Cool. Yeah, so that's world price 2, world supply plus tariff. Now, again, the same exercise where I go across from that price until I hit the supply curve. Well, now you'll notice if you're drawing this along with me, that the supply has increased to Q3. Why does it increase? Well, because at that new higher price, domestic producers are like, you know what, it's kind of worth it now. I can make more of this good because it's a higher price. So the incentive function kicks into the economy and there's an extension along the supply curve. We move from Q1 to Q3. At the same time, demand at this new world price will fall to Q4. Why? Because consumers domestically are like, do you know what? It's really just not worth my while doing this. Why would I do this? It's just not, it's too expensive now. I can't afford to buy as much of it. Therefore, the level of imports will fall to M2. With me so far? Okay, this is the really important bit because from this, we can develop an absolute like plethora of different points. We are going to depict the following areas. So this we're going to label as A. Okay, so that we're going to call A. And we've got our triangle here, which we'll call C, the rectangle C, and the other triangle D. A, B, C, D. Right, before we answer the 15 marker and how I would go through it in terms of an exam, it's important for you to understand this. The theory underpinning this is really important because this is an argument against imposing a tariff. If you had a question which was really straightforward about pros and cons of tariffs, this is number one of your list of why a tariff is bad. But if it's a question about the effects, you should also be able to incorporate this. Now, in every single economy, there are three players: consumer, producer, government. And we are going to illustrate that the net effect of imposing a tariff, the overall effect, is negative. And the way that we do that is we break it down into the three players. So let's start with the consumer first. So I'm going to write C there, okay? Consumer surplus, you should all know, is the difference between the maximum price a consumer is willing and able to pay for a good and the actual price they pay for a good. Now, the way that you do that, even if you've got a question in paper one, theme one, is I want you to put a dot on the maximum price the consumer is willing to pay. You'll then put a dot on the price they are actually paying initially, and you go across from that point until you hit the demand curve. So let's do the 3 dots for our diagram initially. I'm going to do it in red just so that it's easier for you to hopefully see. The starting point is, which curve is the consumer, supply or demand? Well, consumer's demand. What is the maximum price the consumer is willing and able to pay for this good? Always, it's where the demand curve hits the price axis. So do you see that point there? That is the maximum price the consumer is willing and able to pay for the good. What price do they initially get for the good? Well, they get a price of WP1. So I put my second dot there. And the final thing that I do is I go across from that price until I hit the demand curve. So I hit it there. Can you guys see my 3 dots? So I've got 1, 2, 3. That triangle is the initial consumer surplus. Right, let's now do consumer surplus following the tariff. So I'm going to do it in green, so that's hopefully a little bit easier. The maximum price the consumers are willing and able to pay for the good is still exactly where it was before, because the demand curve hasn't shifted. So it's still there. That's still the maximum price they're willing to pay for the good. What's changed, though, is the market price. The price they actually pay for the good is now WP2. It's gone up. So it's there. And then I go across from that point until I hit the demand curve, which is there. So my triangle is this area now. Okay, can everyone see my triangle? It's where the 3 dots, the green dots, intersect. What happened to consumer surplus? Consumer surplus, for those of you that are observant, has fallen by A, B, C, D. The consumer gets absolutely destroyed by a tariff. So we're going to write consumer equals minus A, minus B, minus C, minus D. Disaster for the consumer. So second thing that we're going to now go through is producer surplus. So I'm going to write P just for here. Producer surplus is the difference between the lowest price the producer is willing and able to sell a good for and the price they actually get for the good. Which curve is the producer? The supply curve. Therefore, the first dot is where the supply curve in the US markets, the US suppliers, sell at this price here. What's the world price initially? Here, this dot. And I go across the supply curve, so it was this dot. So the initial surplus is where my 3 black dots are intersecting. Change it to green. The new producer surplus. Well, still, this is the lowest price I'm willing to sell for the good because the actual supply in the US hasn't changed. It's the world supply that changed, not the US producers. The price I actually get for the good is WP2. And I go across from that price until I hit the supply curve, which is there. Okay, so can you see what happened to my producer surplus? My producer surplus has increased by area A. So the producers are better off. So one of the benefits of a subsidy is producer surplus will increase because the government is essentially protecting domestic firms. The final thing is the government. Well, whenever there's a tax, the government always collects revenue. They always make money from a tax. How do I determine what the tax rate is? So if I was doing it in theme 1, the 2 things that I would need to multiply is the tax rate, in other words, how much the government taxes per unit, and I need to multiply that by the number of units that are actually sold of the good, because they can only tax what's sold. Well, in this market, a tax on imports. In other words, I want to know what the tariff is, so the tax, which is going to be the distance between world supply and world supply plus tariff. That's the height of my area. And the width of my area is the new level of imports, because I can only tax what comes into my economy now. I can't tax what used to come in. I can only tax what's coming in now following the imposition of the tariff. Can you see that the width of the area, which we know Q3, Q4, right? There we go, right there, yeah? That is the level of imports. And the height between this point and this point is the tax rate. Therefore, what area does the government collect? They collect C. Can you see that? So therefore, we've got government plus C. All right, so let's look at what we've got so far. We've got the consumers minus A, minus B, minus C, minus D, producers plus A, and the government is plus C. Net effect, like, you know, the most basic of basic maths. In the words of Big Shaq, big maths. Net effect. What's net effect? Well, do you agree that minus A and plus A cancel each other out? So I can eliminate that minus A and that minus and plus A. Minus C and plus C also cancel each other out. What are you left with? You are left with 2 welfare loss triangles of minus B, minus D. The net effect of a tariff is necessarily negative because it means that there is minus B, minus D that has not been accounted for by the free market. The consumer's better, the producer's better off, the government's better off, but overall the consumer's so much worse off that it leads to a net effect. Now, there are two reasons why you have two welfare loss triangles. One, consumers have less choice to face higher price. That's one reason. The second reason why you have welfare loss is because inefficient domestic firms that wouldn't have survived if there were free trade, these firms are now kept in the market. They survive. But the quality of the goods being produced therefore decline. The consumer's allocative efficiency goes down. Okay, now we've gone through the theory. Let's talk about how you go about answering this question, because it said the effect on consumers, or the economic effects was general. I will talk about it from the perspective of the US first. And I will talk about the benefits that arise from imposing a tariff. The diagram that you draw, you'll be able to draw upon it both in analysis and in evaluation. I would draw the diagram, but I would focus on the good things. The first good thing that arises on the back of a tariff is the level of imports coming into the US shrink, they fall. Therefore, the current account deficit will decrease for the US. Now, if this were a 25 marker, I could expand that by going into how that also means that aggregate demand would shift outwards because imports are falling. So X minus M is going down, or M is going down. So AD is shifting outwards. I talk about how there's less of a withdrawal from the circular flow of income, can be a positive multiplier effect, blah, blah, blah. If it's a 50 marker, no need. It's just for me to show you that, look, you can then develop it into an AD point beyond that point. But the first key thing is that your current account deficit is getting better. The other thing that's getting better, which easily you can develop again, is your fiscal deficit. Why? Because the government's collecting tax revenue. When the government collects tax revenue, the fiscal deficit would shrink. National debt, therefore, would also go down. A point again, if I had a 25 marker and I wanted to go into crazy levels of depth and really give yourself multiple chains of reasoning, one of the things that I could describe in a 25 marker is the fact that the USA was, like the UK, downgraded from their credit rating. They don't have the top rating anymore. Well, this might help them regain the AAA credit rating if their national debt goes down. Credit ratings, those of you that don't understand credit ratings, by the way, please just send a message on our Facebook page and I will go through it in a lot more detail. Those of you that are my students that have been to one of our courses, hopefully you do know what I'm talking about. But the idea is that a credit rating would affect the demand for your government bonds. And therefore, if your credit rating is higher, demand for your bonds will go up. The price of each bond will go up and the yield, the interest rate they pay out will go down. It's great for the government because it means it's easier for them to service debts, okay? That's one chunky analysis. Now, I gave you way more than you need to in a 50 marker. Be aware of the fact that I did that. The two key points that I'm looking for you to flesh out is current account deficit will shrink and the fiscal deficit will also get better because the government's going to be protecting domestic firms. You could even make the point about like domestic employment going up because, again, they've got less competition in the world market, but it's going a bit too much now. Evaluation. A really easy evaluation is either to comment on the bad things. And the bad things are that there's welfare loss. So for the US, the end result of a tariff is still negative because of the fact that consumers are going to face higher prices. Consumers are going to have less choice. Allocative efficiency would be falling, okay? So all of these really bad things arise. Domestic firms can become inefficient because they become really complacent and lazy. So the quality, it creates like a dependency culture amongst the producers. And so again, the US firms may start to produce lower quality goods, yeah? That's potential evaluation. Another potential evaluation is that actually, if they're in a trade war, which is what the question's kind of implying, you know how we said your current account deficit might get better? It depends, because it depends on what the other country does as a retaliation. So what did China do when you impose a tariff on their manufacturers? They impose a tariff back on you, and the demand for your exports, so what you sell from the US into China, let's say that were elastic. In other words, they're not that fussed about it. If the price went up, they would go and switch somewhere else, or they just completely reduce their consumption of it. But at the same time, your demand of Chinese goods is inelastic. Are you better off or worse off? You're worse off. The reason why you're worse off is because it means that your exports will fall big time, whereas your imports may not really fall that much. The consumer is willing to pay a higher price for this good if it's inelastic in demand, and so the firm could just pass it on to the consumer, and they don't get a massive reduction in the number of units that they're selling into your economy. Is that clear? In terms of dealing with the other side of it, which is the effects of exporters, looking at it from the perspective of, let's say, the Chinese firms. Very easy to develop because the key things that you'll be developing here is the fact that there'll be less demand for their exports, export revenue will fall, AD might shift inwards, we might get negative economic growth, it might lead to higher levels of unemployment, it may worsen the current account for that particular country, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so it's a really, really straightforward, in-depth kind of chain of reasoning there. The evaluation is to talk about, well, it depends on what proportion of their exports are accounted for by that particular industry. Typically, they will put tariffs on specific industries or specific goods. they don't often go anything coming in from that country. They can, but more often than not, that's not going to be the case. It will be like they're going to impose a tariff on, I don't know, solar panels specifically because of the fact that they felt that they're being dumped into that country. That's an evaluation that you can therefore develop and say, look, actually as a proportion of like actual exports, it's not that significant. China can then redirect their exports. There might be more demand opening up in other parts of the world. So for example, if there's suddenly economic growth in areas like East Asia or wherever, or anywhere in Africa, that would lead to them potentially selling more in those economies, and therefore they're not that bothered about the fact that the US aren't buying as many goods and services off them. If they can easily move their market to another country, their export revenue won't really fall. The other thing to talk about is the fact that even with the tariff, there is a possibility that even with the tariff, you might still be quality competitive. You might still be so good and your goods are so high quality that people would want to buy it regardless. I know that's very similar to the point about PED, but if you develop it and then explain it through PED again, it's a new point, and it's very, very valid as a point. That's how I go through it. Okay? Right, let's have a look at some of the questions. Do I think Brexit will come up? Maybe, but I don't think so. I think partly because it could, by the way, like I probably don't know. Partly because the question in the 25 marker last year for EdXL was the effect of a major depreciation in the pound basically following Brexit. That was their Brexit question. They can, because they have now enough information to be able to ask questions about Brexit. But in essence, I think it's one of those topics where it's just a bit too obvious for it to be asked. I might sound like an idiot in a few weeks' time and it comes up and you're all like, you're an idiot. But that's not to say don't revise it. Do revise it. Understand trading blocks, understand how to answer questions on the effects of a country leaving the trading block. I'll try and cover that in the next session. I'll try and set a date for a next session. I'm not sure when, but we'll get something sorted. Okay, right. Other questions that some of you have asked. Labor markets. Okay. Okay. Those of you that have very specific questions, like when I went through the subsidy diagram, if you rewatch the video and it doesn't make sense, please just message me. Send an email to inquiries@expert-tuition.co.uk, or just send a message to us on YouTube, on Facebook, or on Twitter, any of those accounts, and I will really go into a lot more detail to like kind of clarify. Okay, I have another couple of things that I got asked. One of them was the financial sector, and I want to very quickly go through the financial sector in terms of the hardest topic that could come up about the financial sector. Broadly, the financial sector. You need to understand the role of institutions like banks. It's one of the new additions to the new spec. The key things to understand is that the financial sector enables 5 things to take place very easily. So I'm going to whiz through them really quickly. But again, if any of these don't make sense, you're very welcome to message me and I'll try and answer as soon as possible. But number 1, the first thing that banks enable you to do, or financial systems enable you to do, is to save your money. Because if there wasn't a bank in place, it'd be very difficult for me to like store money anywhere. I have to like put it on my pillow or something. Not the best idea in the world. So that's number 1. It can help facilitate savings. Number 2 is it facilitates lending, because I can go and get a loan from a bank and therefore invest it. It means that I'm less likely to encounter what we call cash flow problems. So let's say, for example, I get paid on the 20th of the month and I have run out of money in my account after the 10th of the month. Well, I don't really want to starve. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go use my credit card, which is essentially a loan from the government, from the bank, sorry, and then I pay that back plus interest. Okay, so that's number 2. It facilitates lending. It's easy for people to borrow money. Number 3 is it facilitates exchange. It's easy for us to buy goods and services because of how sophisticated the financial sector is. Why? Because a lot of transactions nowadays take place electronically, like contactless, Apple Pay, blah, blah, blah. Number 4, it provides a forward market or forward markets. And in particular, there are 2 areas that they focus on. 1 is commodities, and number 2 is exchange rates. A forward market is basically this. It's where you as a producer agree in advance a particular price for your commodity. So let's say I sell cocoa and I am uncertain about what prices are going to be in the future because they're so volatile. What I will do is today agree a fixed price of, I don't know, $20, let's say hypothetically. And in 6 months, 1 year, however long that contract is, I absolutely am guaranteed that the person who bought it will be buying it at that price, irrespective of what actually happened to the market price. Finally, number 5, the last thing that we can talk about is it provides a market for equities, which is just a fancy way of saying you can buy shares in companies. So if I invest in shares in Apple, why would I do that? Well, I would do that because if they make profits, I get dividends. Yay. So those are the 5 key things that you need to understand in terms of the financial sector. The harder topic in the financial sector, I think, is market failure. understanding market failure in the financial sector is really, really important. Two things. One, I will go through it in as much detail as I can in the very short space of time we have left. But number two is we have essay packs, and there is a free version. And in the free version, I actually wrote up an essay which was evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of financial market failure in the financial sector, which honestly I think is like one of the worst questions that you guys can get. But hopefully once you go through that question, you'll understand it's not too bad. Okay, so can we actually deal with that question then, despite it being in that that pack, the free version? Let's go through how we go about answering that. In terms of the key points, I think the financial sector and market failure in the financial sector is best summarized by 2008. The financial crash is a great way of just answering that question. You can focus exclusively almost on that. There are other things as well, which I'm sure you may have gone through at school, such as the LIBOR scandal, which is essentially where banks were colluding with one another to fix a artificially high interest rate. So you had Barclays, Deutsche Bank, I think Swiss banks were involved as well, I think Credit Suisse and UBS. It led to major fines, etc., etc. That could be a paragraph that you would talk about, like when they can collude because it's an oligopoly and things like that. But to be honest with you, I don't think you need to, because you've got really strong points that you can make from the financial sector, the financial crash, sorry. In 2008, the key things that you need to understand, there's a video that I will, again, post on our Facebook page, a link to a YouTube video. It is not our video, it's amazing. It explains the financial crash in a way that I can only wish I could explain. But the essence is this, there was a bubble in the housing market because of something called subprime mortgages. Subprime mortgages were this idea that individuals that would not typically be getting houses, getting a mortgage, were getting a mortgage, partly because they were trying to sell these assets called CDOs. Watch the video, it will explain it much better than I do. I'm really pressed for time, so I'm kind of rushing through. But the point is this, is that eventually, whenever you have a bubble is that the price of an asset is significantly inflated. It's so much higher than what it really should be in a normal market. And bubbles always burst, they always pop. In other words, if the price is like all the way up here, eventually it will burst and come back down. So the first thing that happens is those individuals obviously start defaulting because there's no way they were ever going to be able to pay their mortgage if their incomes are really low, they haven't been credit checked, all of those things, right? That increases the supply of housing in the market and causes the price of houses to go down, which is unusual because house prices usually are always rising. The first micro point that you could therefore make in your essay is if house prices are falling, you get a negative wealth effect, which you should all know from theme 2, okay? Negative wealth effect is the idea that if your assets are worth less, then you feel less confident because you've got less to fall back on. So your consumption levels will fall, AD will shift inwards, consumption is pretty significant as well, by the way. And you can talk about economic growth, unemployment, you can go mad. You've got loads of points that you can say there. A micro point that arises from house prices plummeting because of market failure in the financial sector, because of the bubble and how the bubble burst, in the sense that the price was really inflated and then it came like tumbling down. Let's say hypothetically, you bought a house in the midst of the bubble for £600,000, okay? So you bought a house for £600,000 because you thought, hey, you know what? I want to buy a house right now. But the price of housing was very high at the time because it was a bubble. And then house prices collapse so that suddenly the price of a house is, your house is only worth £200,000. You suffer from something really interesting called negative equity. Negative equity is essentially the idea that even if you sold your house, so if I sold my house, I get £200,000 for it. Does that mean I am debt-free now? No, because I still owe the bank another £400,000. So what happens there? The problem that happens there is that it creates market failure in the labor market because labor becomes geographically immobile. Why? Because if I got a job offer in Birmingham, but I have a house in London that suddenly is worth less than how much I paid for it, I need to sell the house in order to move to Birmingham and get another house. But even if I sold the house, I still owe the bank £400,000. Therefore, I'm stuck. I can't actually move to Birmingham. I can't take up that job. Therefore, you have immobility in terms of geographical immobility of labor. Yeah? So that's the first market failure that arises on a micro level. Okay? The other micro effects as well, by the way, not just in terms of mobility of labor, but jobs are being lost because of the fact that firms' profits are declining, etc., etc. We'll get to that in a sec. Okay? Another point that you could talk about is the fact that many banks had taken out such excessive risk and taken on loads of like mortgages. Banks had bought these things called CDOs. Again, the video will really clarify this in terms of what these are. But because of that, it meant that their profits they'd collapsed. They were so bad. What did the government therefore have to do? the government in the UK had to intervene and bail out the banks. They bailed out RBS, they bailed out Lloyds, and they bailed out, the first one was Northern Rock, yeah? And that was so expensive to do. The estimate of how much the government spent bailing out the banks was approximately £500 billion. If you look at a chart of the UK's fiscal deficit, in fact, you can look at the paper 3, June 2017, paper 3, second data response has, I think, figure 5. It shows you the fiscal deficit. Look at what happens when you get to like 2009. Fiscal deficit, it goes through the roof. So you've got a negative number, and then it just goes super negative. It just like drops like that. Why? Because the government had to spend loads of money. When the government spends loads of money, that means the national debt is also going up. If the national debt is going up, that is likely to have an adverse effect on the UK's credit rating, and it did. In 2012, the UK was downgraded for the very first time ever. And why they were downgraded was because of the fact that the credit rating agency was like, the national debt is just too big. It's just really kind of uncomfortable now. Credit rating going down would lead to less demand for government bonds, less of a price, a lower price for each bond, and therefore the yield will go up. Cost of borrowing for the government will go up. Disaster. Okay, really, really bad. That's another macro point that you could develop there. Okay, micro points. Well, if there's suddenly like really low confidence in the economy, are people spending or not spending? Well, they're not spending. Therefore, what's happening to firms' profits? They're going down. You can draw an AR curve, a cost and revenue diagram with AR shifting inwards and MR shifting inwards as well. And talk about the fact that firms are shutting down, the fact that there's more unemployment, more workers are getting redundant, blah, blah, blah. You get the point. There's a lot of things that you can actually say by talking about the financial crash in 2008 and 2009. Okay, right. So we are practically at 9 o'clock. I said I would go through a particular diagram. I'm going to go through 2 diagrams as sort of like a little bonus at the end of this. The first diagram I'm going to quickly go through is the price discrimination diagram, and there's a lot of dispute as to what this diagram looks like. I'll explain why I want you to do it my way. And number 2, the second diagram that I want to go through very briefly is the King demand curve, and just to go through that. So if you're still awake and not asleep and still functioning, then come along for the journey. So let's do price discrimination first. First, before I actually draw it, a word of kind of technique. If you're pressed for time, you are allowed to just draw the 2 submarkets. So let's say I was doing students, adults. I just draw, there are different elasticities and therefore different prices for the submarkets, and it will be fine. But in order for you to really show off, I ideally would want you to have 3 diagrams side by side, okay? And this is how we are going to draw. I'll do my very best to have it in a way where you can see as I kind of go along. But the starting point is we are going to draw ourselves 3 axes side by side. Okay, so I mean, this board is absolutely tiny. Right, so I'm gonna have to somehow squeeze it. That's disastrous, but it will do. Okay, and underneath each of these, we're gonna label it. So underneath the first one, these are the 2 submarkets, and the last one is the firm. So I'm gonna do students underneath the first market, adults, second market, and firms, or yeah, firm, third market. Now, obviously, if you know what the firm is, so let's say it was View Cinema, or it was Jessop's, or Apple, whoever, you write their name underneath where you've written firm, okay? And then obviously we've got cost/revenue in the y-axis across all 3, and output, output, output. Okay, so this is where we can show off a little bit. The starting point is just drawing a very standard MC curve, as you always do for the firm. Okay, so I'm just going to draw my standard MC curve, sort of like that. Okay, but now I purposely want you to start at a particularly high point on the y-axis, somewhere like there. Okay, for the firm. And the idea is that if the price is really, really high initially, then only the adults will be able to afford this particular item. We'll assume that students at that price can't even afford to buy 1 unit. So therefore, the demand will initially be very, very inelastic because only the adults will be in the market. So I'm going to draw something like this, where it's like very, very inelastic, AR. But then eventually, if I keep going down, eventually it gets to a price that's low enough that consumers in the student market can now afford to buy, let's say, a cinema ticket or, I don't know, a Mac, yeah? Therefore, the demand curve kinks outwards. This is not the King demand curve, to be clear. It's a kink, but it's not the King demand curve. It kinks outwards to take into account the fact that now the students can now afford to buy this particular good as well. So I've got AR looks something like that. Right? Mine is really, really bent. But the idea is that it starts off being very inelastic, and then it becomes elastic because the students have now entered the market. MR is just half the slope, so I'm going to try and make that a little bit better. It will look sort of like this. Again, this is not easy to draw on this, but here we go. You can see that, MR. Okay, now, this third diagram is, in my opinion, illustrating the effect of the firm not price discriminating. If the firm did not price discriminate and only set one universal price, the price they would set is that they go to profit maximization. So I'm going to go to where MC is equal to MR. I'm going to dot down. I'm going to call that QE, just say calling something. And then to get the price, I always dot up until I hit the demand curve, AR. So I go up, hit the AR curve, and I've got this as my price. Okay? So this is really straightforward now. We want them to be making supernormal profits. They're in an oligopoly typically, or they are a monopoly. And so realistically, they are going to make supernormal profits whether or not they price discriminate. Whether they make more or less profits will depend on whether they price discriminate or not. But the key is that they are likely to make more supernormal profits. Sorry, my laptop is about to die, so I'm putting the charger in. Okay, cool. So they are making supernormal profits. I'm going to set an AC curve, but I'm going to manipulate it on purpose. The reason I'm going to manipulate it on purpose is to make your life a little bit easier. If I dot up from the equilibrium quantity to where it hits the MC curve, do you agree that it's there? So where MC is equal to MR. I'm on purpose, and you'll see why in a second, going to set my AC curve right there. Okay? So I'm going to draw AC there. And then the cost for the firm, I dot up from QE, hits it there. So cool. So therefore, the supernormal profits that the firm would extract if they weren't to price discriminate would basically be this area here. Is that clear? Cool. Now, one of the key assumptions in a price discrimination diagram, and it's a very fair assumption, is that marginal costs will be constant between the sub-markets. That makes sense because, for example, if I went to the cinema or you went to the cinema, the actual cost of them providing a seat for me as an adult is exactly the same as it is for you as a student. It doesn't cost them any more. The cleaning services, whatever it is that they have to basically pay for, the staff, it's the same thing whether I'm there or you're there. Therefore, when you get a price discrimination question, you need to understand that between the sub-markets, we're going to draw a perfectly elastic MC curve to say, look, the cost is just this. This is the marginal cost, irrespective of whether it's an adult going in, whether it's 5 adults, 6 adults. Per adult, the cost is this, and per student, the cost is also the same thing. A really good question for you to do, by the way, is June 2017, old spec, unit 3. So theme 3 for you guys now. Unit 3, June 2017, has a multiple choice question, which was actually taken from the international paper. They didn't even bother like changing the numbers, I don't think. But anyways, and it was asking you to determine what the price will be during school holiday times versus summertime or like holidays. Yeah? Or term time, sorry, what I'm talking about. Yeah. Anyways, the point is that if I know that this is my cost by going up to where my quantity hits the MC curve, okay, can you see that point there where it hits the MC curve? So there we go. Yeah. I will now draw solid lines across in the sub-markets at that exact same cost. So I'm going to draw my AC curve, MC. Yeah, I'm going to call that MC. And bear in mind, by the way, that I purposely manipulated my diagram so that I got AC to also intersect MC exactly at the point where Q went up and hit MC. So that I can also say MC is equal to AC then. So, right, it's extremely difficult to draw on a tiny, tiny little board like that, but here we go, okay? That is MC equals AC across the two sub-markets, being students and adults. Cool, everyone with me so far? This is the easy bit now. Now we've done the hard bit. The easy bit is just now we do the students and then the adults. Well, let's start with the adult market. The adult market, is that going to be elastic or inelastic? Well, it's extremely inelastic because they're the ones that can afford a higher price. So what I want is an MR and AR that are highly inelastic. And a good way to do that is you start at a high point. So you know where I started on my third diagram? So you see how I started over there? I would start the same point like there. Okay, I'd start match it up a little bit. And I would make it fairly inelastic. I'm going to write AR. And MR is just half that slope, MR. Again, profit maximization occurs where MC is equal to MR. So I dot down from that point to determine how many units are sold to the adults. So I'll call that Q2. And I will dot up until I hit the AR curve to get my price P2. Yeah, got my quantity, I got my price. I can now shade in the supernormal profits because it's the distance between P2 and the cost, which we know is the perfectly elastic line. So the supernormal profits that the firm makes from the adults is that. Students are elastic in demand. Therefore, what I would do is I would start at the point at which I kinked my curve in the third diagram, because that was the point at which the students entered the market. So you see how I've got it as, where are we? As over there. I want to go across from that same point and start like over there. So I'm going to draw sort of, make it really elastic to just exaggerate the difference between the two. Profit maximization again occurs where MC is equal to MR. I dot down, I get my quantity, Q1. I dot up to AR, I get my price, P1. I shade in my super normal profit area. Yep. And the diagram is done. You'll notice a couple of things. One, do you notice that the price charged to the adults is higher than the price charged to the students? That is imperative. It is really important that that actually does happen, because that's the whole point of price discrimination. Two is the reason why I think there are certain textbooks that argue that, look, diagram number 1 plus diagram number 2 is equal to diagram number 3. And if you wrote that, you're not going to get penalized. It would still be okay. But the reason why I don't think that's true is because you can clearly see that they are extracting significantly more profit if they were to separate the market and make as much profit as they can from the students and as much profit as they can from the adults. That is greater than the profit they would make if they had one price that they set for both the adults and the students. That's the price discrimination diagram, okay? Last diagram, and then we can all go to sleep. Last diagram is the king demand curve. And a couple of things about the king demand curve. First and foremost, the king demand curve, they are not allowed to ask you a question about it explicitly. But it is a point that can be mentioned or will be mentioned on a mark scheme. The question I got was, what is the king demand curve and when would I use it? Very straightforward. It's normally an argument in favor of or argument against pricing strategies in general. So if you're talking about oligopolists and how they would compete with one another, this is arguing that they would not compete with one another through prices. It's illogical, according to this particular theory, for them to compete against each other through prices. They should only focus their attention on non-price things like advertising or, I don't know, loyalty schemes or merge or whatever, okay? So the diagram and the theory is really, really straightforward, actually. And it's going to look something like this. So let's make it a little bit bigger. Here's our axes, cost of revenue and quantity. The first thing to understand is that we assume that the firm is operating at a particular point, which we're going to call point A. Okay, so just point like that, where the price, if I dot across, is that PE, and the quantity they're selling is QE. Okay, everyone with me so far? So I've got a price of PE and I've got a quantity of QE. Now, two scenarios. Scenario number one is that you as the oligopolist decide to raise your price above PE. So that's the price at this moment in time. What should I, as the other oligopolist, do according to this theory? Some of you might be shouting out, raise your price as well, let's collude, right? And that's an evaluation, by the way, of the king demand curve, is that it kind of ignores the prospective collusion. It doesn't take it into account. But they're arguing that if it's a competitive market, the logical thing for me to do is that I don't change my price. Because if you charge a higher price and I keep mine the same, your customers are going to come to me en masse. Therefore, if we're depicting it from your perspective as your demand curve, when you raise your price above PE, the demand is extremely elastic. Why is it elastic? Because the smallest change in the price and loads of your customers will come over to me. Therefore, I would make above point A, so above this, we're going to draw it really, really, really elastic, like this, okay? And the idea is that the tiniest change in the price upwards from PE to like, I don't know, like P1 there, would lead to a massive reduction in demand. Like the quantity would fall all the way down to like over there. Is it worth doing? No. Scenario number two. Scenario number two is that you reduce your price. What do I do? Well, if you're reducing your price, it makes sense for me to also reduce my price because I don't want you to take my customers away. Therefore, although you might get a few more customers, because let's say you reduce your price a little bit more than I do, you're not going to get many customers because in essence, everyone else, all the oligopolists are going to follow suit and also cut their prices. Therefore, the demand when the price is below PE is extremely inelastic. Okay? So it looks like that. Below PE, demand is extremely inelastic. Above PE, demand is extremely elastic. Okay? Now, we know that from theme 3 that the demand curve has another name, which is the AR curve. So we're going to depict this as AR equals D. Cool? Marginal revenue is just half the slope of average revenue. always. Now, those of you that do maths, those of you that don't, honestly, it really doesn't matter. Like, you just need to understand that the point at which it kinks is called a stationary point or a turning point, okay? And the elasticity always is perfectly inelastic. It's basically equal to 0 in terms of gradient, and that means that the PED is going to be perfectly inelastic because that's what 0 is. So I'm going to do this in terms of another color just to make it like kind of clearer. What I do is I start at the same point on my AR curve, like there. But now I go half the slope, sort of like that, until it hits the kink. When it hits the kink, it's going to become perfectly inelastic. So like that. And then MR again goes half the slope of the AR curve. I've kind of covered my QE a little bit, but there's my MR. Cool? MR is half the slope, so you basically go halfway up until you hit the kinked point or that dotted line, go straight line, and then it's half the slope again. Why is this important? The reason why this is important is because it's going to illustrate that prices are likely to be sticky in an oligopoly, which is just the fancy way of saying oligopolists are unlikely to alter their prices very much. Because I can draw you multiple MC curves now. So irrespective of what the variable cost is for this particular firm, so let's say oil prices went up or went down, or wage costs went up or went down, you can have multiple MC curves, and yet no matter which MC curve I look at, my output will always be QE, and my price will always be PE. So I'm going to draw you a couple of MC curves to kind of illustrate that. So MC1, MC2. Okay, right. Have a look at my MC curves. Here we go. Now, it means I only have to draw more than one, but I'm just illustrating it for the purpose of you understanding it. Profit maximization always occurs where MC is equal to MR. Well, MC is equal to MR where the MC curve hits that straight line, the perfectly inelastic section of the MR curve. Then I get my quantity by dotting down from that point. What's my quantity? Well, my quantity is QE. How do I get my price? I go up from that quantity until I hit the AR curve. Well, I got exactly from QE. I hit the exact kink point. What's my price? My price is PE. If I have a marginal cost of MC2, what's my output? It's still QE. What's my price? It's still PE. And same thing for MC3. The point then is that irrespective of what your marginal cost is, I appreciate that there is a point if it went really, really high, it would be above that. So that's again like a flaw in the theory. But we assume that your MC curve is going to be somewhere in that range. And therefore, no matter what your marginal cost is, even if your variable cost went up or went down, you will continue to produce QE units and you will continue to price it at PE. It doesn't make sense to raise your price, because if you raise your price, you'll lose loads of market share. Those people will take customers away from you because they'll keep their prices the same. If you reduce your price, it also doesn't make sense because everyone else will just do the same thing. And what's the point? You don't make any money or don't make as much money. Therefore, the kink demand curve is just an evaluation of pricing strategies, and it's an illustration of why they are unlikely to compete against one another using prices. Is that clear? How would I throw it into an essay? Well, if I were doing a pricing versus non-pricing strategy essay, it could be an evaluation of pricing strategies in general. If the essay talked about how firms are not changing their prices, and I could illustrate that as a reason why, it could be because of the fact that, hey, you know what, the demand, there's kink demand curve, and so it doesn't make sense for them to change their prices. Basically, yeah. Okay, right. I really hope that was helpful. Sorry, I'm getting used to this and the technicalities of all of this. I will try my best to set another date for us to do another session because time went really fast. I didn't get through anywhere near as much as what I wanted to go through. I will be posting questions from time to time on our Facebook page, and I will do a couple of clarifications of certain things. So, for example, on my list of things that you guys had that you wanted me to go through, it included things like price caps, and I didn't have a chance to go through that. It included things like externalities, and I didn't get a chance to go through that. But I will try and put that on the Facebook page, and I'll try and run another of these sessions. Yeah, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, like our Facebook page, and good luck.